Mr. O'Sullivan.
Present.
Mr. President, Ms. Dell has sent her regrets. She's unable to attend tonight. And so you have quorum.
Thank you. A quorum has been determined and the State Board will now proceed with the business portion of our meeting. Members, we have a draft agenda before us. I want to note for the public that we have added an item to our administrative list, approval of a letter to the mayor on, disregard that, sorry. Is there a motion to approve the minutes or the agenda for tonight's meeting?
So moved.
Second.
Being moved and properly seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, please say nay. The motion is approved. Members, we also have the minutes from our last working session on March 3rd. Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes for that meeting? Seeing no changes, I will now entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Being properly moved and seconded, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. It appears as the ayes have it, and the minutes have been approved. Good evening again. My name is Zachary Parker, Ward 5 representative and president of the State Board of Education. On behalf of the members of the District of Columbia State Board of Education, I welcome our guests and our viewing public to tonight's meeting. It is being held virtually due to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. This video for all of our meetings, including tonight's, are posted on our YouTube page at DC SBOE and rebroadcasted on the District Knowledge Network. Please note that the State Board will hold a special working session on March 25th at 5 p.m. This special meeting is being held to discuss OSCE's previously announced application to the U.S. Department of Education to waive requirements of the Every Student Succeeds Act, primarily related to the accountability and statewide assessments. We encourage the public to watch the meeting, examine the waiver proposal, and provide comments to the State Board so they can be included in our official response. We will resume our regular meeting schedule with a working session on April 7th, where we will discuss, among other things, State Board committee working plans. You will recall that the State Board submitted a budget recommendation letter to Mayor Bowser last month with funding priorities, including a need to increase DC's at-risk weight. Tonight, the State Board will hear from an expert panel on how schools are planning for fiscal year 2022, which begins in October, with a particular focus on how LEAs are using and should use funds earmarked for students designated as at risk. Tonight's discussion is one of many ways the State Board continues to highlight the focus areas of our equity framework, which calls for, among other things, improving outcomes for students designated as at risk. We will also vote tonight to formally adopt our highly anticipated all-teacher survey, which documents the experiences and perspectives of over 1,000 DC teachers. I look forward to sharing more about the report and our findings later in tonight's agenda. Tonight, we will also consider 4 ceremonial resolutions. Ceremonial resolutions are used by the State Board to recognize important people and dates. Tonight, we will honor a National Women's History Month, Music in Schools Month, Social Workers Month, and the incomparable Nannie Helen Burroughs. Before we continue with our meeting, I do want to acknowledge the ongoing pandemic and the impact that it is having on our students and families, and acknowledging that many of our neighbors are both suffering and in pain due to losing loved ones. I would also like to acknowledge the incidents of yesterday, the murder that happened in Atlanta. And while details are still becoming more clear for us, it is not lost on me, as well as members of the board, that 6 of the 8 individuals that were murdered last night were of Asian American descent. And this coincides at a time when there has been a rise in hate crimes against Asian American individuals in this country over the past year, upwards or nearly 3,800 to be exact. So I've asked my colleague, Alistair Chang, who is the State Board's first and only Asian American representative, to make comment on this, as well as to call all of us to action and how we can rally both around the victims of last night's incident, but lend our voice to concerned neighbors here in DC. So with that, Representative Chang, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, President Parker. Yeah, so the concern for me, right, is that this is one of over nearly 4,000 firsthand complaints that have been tracked by a coalition reporting racism and discrimination against Asian Americans in the US this year, since last March. And today I heard from several students, families, educators who reached out sharing fears and concerns here in DC. And I do want to just acknowledge that and make sure that you know that you are not alone, that I've talked with several of the other board members and want you to know that we hear you. And for me, what happened in Atlanta further reinforces the important role that educators have to play in combating hate and violence, and reinforces the important work that the board has been doing around revising the social study standards. You know, for me personally, I just want to share that having run my campaign during the pandemic, right? The number of racist email messages, text messages, names on the street that I got called have really affected the way that I think about my place in this community. And so I would love if everyone would join me who's hearing this today and in calling it out when you see it, when you hear it. One of the common themes that connected a lot of these incidents is a statement of, you know, people saw me getting attacked and no one came over to help. And I think that is a common thing that a lot of AAPI folks in our community and that I've experienced in DC, which is a certain invisibility, right? And you know, this is the first time we've acknowledged that there are any Asian students in the city at all since I've joined, right? And it's something that I would like to continue to work on with everyone because it is a different experience than the Black, white, and Latino experience that we more frequently talk about.
Thank you, Representative. We will now turn to Interim State Superintendent Shauna Young for an opening statement that she has prepared for us tonight.
Thank you, President Parker, and thank you, Representative Chang, for those remarks. And we stand with you in the Asian American community as well, against hatred and against the violence that we've experienced in our communities. President Parker and State Board members, it's good to be with each of you this evening for our monthly public meeting. Much has happened in the past month since I've been here last, and today I want to share more context with you on our application to the U.S. Department of Education for a waiver of the statewide assessments in English, math, and science for spring 2021, along with the accountability waiver, which is a new template just released for the accountability flexibilities that we previously presented to you via the accountability addendum. As you know, and as we've said before, the district is deeply committed to statewide assessments because we believe that common statewide data on the academic performance of our schools is important. We value the use of comparable student performance data and recognize its value, particularly now as we look forward to a period of recovery and helping our schools focus on students' unfinished learning and accelerating academic achievement. The decision to apply for a waiver is not one we took lightly. As you know, the public health emergency continues to have a profound impact on our school communities in the district. As a geographically small urban jurisdiction, our communities are at high risk and we experienced great trauma. The vast majority of our students have been learning virtually for the past year. We know our schools are facing tough challenges and we want to be as helpful as possible as they work to reopen and support students in both remote and in-person settings. As part of this decision to apply for a waiver, we considered our ability to ensure equitable distribution of the statewide assessments, to responsibly report out on results that are valid for the ways that we use them here, and our ability to focus on improving student achievement with timely information to direct educational resources. So this leads us to seek a one-year waiver from requirements of the Every Student Succeeds Act relating to statewide assessments in ELA, math, and science. We have been working with the U.S. Department of Education on crafting our waiver package, which will be released publicly on the OSSI website on Friday, March 19th. As we prepare to publicly release our waiver request, I wanted to keep the board and the public informed of our steps and provide some high-level thoughts on what we are proposing and our next steps for engagement with the board and the public. I'd just like to add also to thank you for your patience in this process, as it has been both time sensitive and moving. So I just want to thank you again to the board for that. When the U.S. Department of Education provided guidance to states on waiving statewide assessments, they encourage states to administer assessments when possible. However, they are affording states the opportunity to waive the 95% participation requirements for statewide assessments in federal law. Our waiver includes waiving the administration, our waiver request includes waiving the administration of the PARCC English Language Arts and Math assessments, the DC Science Assessment, and the alternative statewide assessments for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. We believe that this plan responds to the unique needs of the district. We've been working with the department to craft a plan that should meet their expectations. OSSI is committed to working with LEA schools and the community to advance student academic achievement. We believe in knowing where our students are academically. An accurate picture of performance allows us the ability to target resources, support our partners, and drive programmatic change. We're concerned that the statewide assessments will not meet these needs in this very unusual year, and therefore OSSI is requesting approval to take a broader portfolio approach to understanding academic performance. Waiving statewide assessments does not mean that we waive our responsibilities to collect and share information on our students and to use this information to direct our resources and drive academic achievement. To fulfill our commitment, we will be proposing to analyze both existing data and new information shared by LEAs and schools in their continuous education plans, reporting out publicly on key elements of these plans, requiring schools to administer and report on local formative assessments, ensuring transparent sharing of academic performance with parents and caretakers, and arming stakeholders with new information to inform research. Our waiver request will outline more specific details on this path forward, and we look forward to going over it in detail with the board in an upcoming special meeting on March 25th. Our waiver will be available for public review and comment on the OSSI website on Friday, March 19th. At that time, members of the public can provide comment, information for which will also be available on the website. I appreciate the board's flexibility due to the time-sensitive nature of this endeavor and look forward to answering your questions on March 25th. Our statewide assessment systems provide us critical information on academic performance across the city, and our application for a waiver this year does not change our commitment to them. We believe that the plans described today and that will be laid out in our waiver application are the best path forward for our this time, and we look forward to more discussion and public comment on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent. And I do want to acknowledge my appreciation on behalf of the board of how, in particular, how communicative OSSI has been and collaborative with the board. And so we do appreciate it, and we do look forward to that special working session. So thank you. Members, we are now going to switch gears and move towards acknowledging our first ceremonial resolution for the night. CR 21-3, National Women's History Month, is the resolution. First up, is there a motion on the resolution?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Being properly moved and seconded, we will now open up the floor for discussion on the resolution. Or actually, I'm sorry, Mr. Hayworth, may you read the resolution into the record before we open it up for discussion?
Thank you, Mr. President. State Board of Education Ceremonial Resolution celebrating National Women's History Month, CR 21-3. Whereas the United States observes National Women's History Month each year from March 1st to 31st, continuing a tradition that began as Women's History Week in Sonoma County, California in 1978, and 9 years later in 1987, Congress officially recognized Women's History Month in the United States. Whereas the purpose of National Women's History Month is to celebrate the culture, contributions, achievements, and history of women of every age, race, ethnicity, and economic background. Whereas National Women's History Month also acknowledges International Women's Day, which is held on March 8th annually. Whereas celebrating Women's History Month increases awareness of the issues that women face due to historic and current systemic sexism, discrimination, and marginalization. Whereas each year Women's History Month celebrates a certain theme, And in 2021, the theme is Choose to Challenge, which calls for challenging and calling out gender bias and inequality, choosing to celebrate women's achievements, and creating an inclusive world. From challenge comes change. Whereas 2021 was ushered in with Vice President Kamala Harris taking the oath of office as the first woman and first Black and South Asian Vice President of the United States. Whereas more than 375,000 District of Columbia residents identify as women, according to most recent estimates from the United States Census Bureau. Whereas women have been leaders not only in securing their own rights for suffrage and equal opportunity, but also in abolitionist movements, emancipation movements, the industrial labor movement, civil rights movements, and especially the peace movement, among others, which creates a more fair and just society for all. Whereas while the suffragettes and other white activists have made important contributions to women's history, the contributions of women of color must also be celebrated and uplifted. And whereas National Women's History Month will be commemorated this year in district schools and neighborhoods with socially distanced and virtual events, festivals, performances, programs, and activities. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the DC State Board of Education recognizes and celebrates National Women's History Month and the achievements and contributions and existence of the district's women, including our female state board members. And be it further resolved that the state board recognizes and values the importance of culturally sustaining pedagogy, anti-sexism, and women's voices as important elements of equity and excellence in education.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. Is there a discussion on the resolution? Representative O'Leary.
Yes, I just would like to let everyone know that I am the product of who I am today because of all the women in my life. My mother and my wives and my daughters, and especially the people that formed me as a professional. And I've mentioned Dr. Margaret Labatt before. She passed away in the fall, but she was the person that hired me, and she was my mentor forever. And I just, I think that I just can't wait till we have a woman president. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Sutter.
Thank you. I'm pleased that the board has chosen to honor this month, specifically here in the District of Columbia, where we have a female executive, a majority female council, a majority female state board, and so many tremendous female educators who serve our children every day. So delighted that we're honoring this, and I look forward to all the female students in our city who will make history in the future for the District of Columbia.
Thank you, Representative. Is there further discussion? Representative Wattenberg.
I was just thumbs up.
Very well, very well. All right, seeing no further discussion, Mr. Hayworth, can we call the roll?
Dr. Gasoi.
Aye.
Mr. Chang.
Aye.
Ms. Wattenberg. You're on mute. Dr. O'Leary.
I don't want to say yes.
Dr. Sutter.
Aye.
Ms. Thompson.
Aye.
Dr. Reid.
Aye.
Mr. Patterson.
Aye.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Aye.
President Parker.
Aye.
The vote is unanimous.
Thank you. We will now move to our second ceremonial resolution, which is CR 21-4, Music in Schools Month. Is there a motion on the resolution?
So moved.
Second to Vice President Gasoi. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Representative Sutter. Mr. Hayworth, being that it has been properly moved and seconded, may you read the resolution into the record?
State Board of Education Ceremonial Resolution honoring Music in Our Schools Month, CR 21-4. Whereas Music in Our Schools Month is an annual celebration during March, which engages music educators, students, and communities from around the country in promoting the benefits of music education programs in schools. Whereas Music in Our Schools Month began in New York as a statewide advocacy day and celebration in 1973, growing into a month-long national celebration of school music in 1985. Whereas the District of Columbia has produced not only prominent musicians such as Duke Ellington and Ron Holloway, but also made impacts on musical genres such as jazz, bluegrass, funk, and go-go, the official music of Washington, D.C. Whereas each year, Music in Our Schools Month celebrates a different theme, with this year's theme being Music, the Sound of My Heart, which brings students and music educators together to celebrate music education in their school communities and sharing how music resonates with them. Whereas this year's theme points to the social and emotional benefits of music for students and how the joy of music plays such an important role during the struggles and challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. Whereas due to the pandemic, schools are faced with budgetary and safety constraints that threaten the existence of arts like music in schools. Now more than ever, it will be imperative to recognize the significant influence of a well-rounded education has on school-aged children and communities. Whereas music education has been shown in research to be an important component to students' social and emotional well-being. Playing musical instruments and listening to music may help students relax, relieve stress, build self-efficacy, as well as improving students' academic performance and outcomes, such as their likelihood of being accepted into colleges. Whereas local schools like Duke Ellington School of the Arts, one of the top schools in the nation and recipient of the Exemplary School Award from the Art School Network, both celebrates the arts and produces students who have been shown to earn more course hour credits than many of their peers who attend other DC public schools, as well as on-time graduation rates of about 98%. Whereas elementary and secondary school emergency relief funding passed by Congress in December 2020 as part of the COVID-19 relief bill may be used to support music instruction while mitigating the spread of COVID-19 through the training of music educators, purchasing of masks, bell covers, and other protective equipment for use in the music classroom. Now therefore be it resolved that the DC State Board of Education celebrates local music education programs, organizations, and events, including the DC Keys, the Eastern High School Marching Band, DC Public Schools Honors Ensembles, the DCPS Music and Performing Arts Festival, and the DC Strings, who have offered free virtual music lessons to children who are striving to learn even during a global pandemic. And be it further resolved that the State Board recognizes and celebrates the 36th annual Music in Our Schools Month and the thousands of educators and students in the district who bring the joy of music to our city.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. Is there discussion on this resolution? Vice President.
Oh, yes. So I will just say, like, sorry, the women in our lives who we cannot do without. So I'm also commenting on the last one. We certainly are at a loss without music in our lives. And I'm really glad that we are on, raising this up on the state board. And I hope that going into the next school year that we do not shortchange our students in music or arts. So thank you.
Thank you. Representative Sutter.
Thank you. I was pleased to see that we called out DC Strings in our resolution, as DC Strings does a lot of work with schools here in Ward 6. I also want to recognize a few of the Ward 6 musical ensembles, the Eastern High School Marching Band, the Stuart Hobson Band, the choir at Ammon and Bowen Elementary. Sorry, getting my schools all mixed up. The music in our schools is an important part of a well-rounded education. And I certainly hope that as we return to schools, we see it not only continued, but also expanded as a way to reconnect our students to one another and to the joy that they should associate with school. So thanks to all who make music in our schools possible. And I certainly hope we see an expansion of it.
Thank you, Representative. It's always impressive when members can rattle off schools. So kudos to you. Representative Thompson.
I appreciate this because I look forward to the day where music actually returns to all of our schools in a robust way. So many of our schools in Ward 7 and in other parts of the city don't offer real robust music programs. And quite frankly, if we did not have the robust music programs we had when my mom was a kid, and when I was a kid, we wouldn't have the city's official music go-go. That comes out of our public high schools. Like they learn to play at places like Shaw and Blue and Eastern, and they have storied histories. And I fear that we're losing that. And so I appreciate the board for passing this ceremonial resolution, and I look forward to being one of the city officials who encourages our city to move on a path where we can make it more than ceremonial.
I'm seeing a lot of head nods. Here. Representative Reid.
Ditto to what Representative Thompson said. We have a strong legacy of marching bands also, between Eastern's wonderful marching band and then the Big Bad Blue Band. We also have a beautiful space at Blue High School here in Ward 8 that we would love that auditorium to be filled with the sound of music from our students. So we would love to see that investment in musical opportunities. I also have to give a shout out to String Queens. Not one of the members is a fabulous educator at KIPP, Kendall Isidore. So balancing having a career in education and then also giving the city beautiful music. And then lastly, I would have to say, after listening to 10 hours of testimony during the Committee of the Whole's education hearing, I'll be remiss not to acknowledge the push for teachers at Duke Ellington to have pay parity, so that outstanding program can continue to receive the services that those students are tapping into, but you know that those professionals are rendering to our students. So thank you.
Absolutely. Representative Patterson.
Yes, since everyone has started to kind of name individuals, I wanted to point out a particular music teacher at Ludlow Taylor, Mr. Levy, who is an awesome person. And I just remember the very first time that I walked into that school, and he was in the foyer playing music, inviting kids up to play. He got my son interested in music. My son now has organ in his area, a little keyboard in his area, all because of Mr. Levy. It was also a very relaxing thing for my son as he's gone through different things emotionally. And I don't think we always appreciate just how much music and artistry plays for our children and for their well-being. So I want to shout him out. And of course, the String Queens, because I know a lot of them personally. I do know Kendall and the other String Queens that have also been featured throughout this month. Just really appreciate this resolution. And as Representative Thompson has said, I want to make this more, an emphasis for us as a State Board of Education, and glad we're doing this evening.
Is there further discussion? Representative O'Leary.
I'm going to cross-pollinate and talk about the world famous Cardozo Marching Band. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you haven't been around here very long. But in the Cardozo Marching Band was about 280 members. We went to the Rose Bowl parade in the early 80s. And I know that since that time, whenever I talked about being a Cardozo, people from wherever or whatever part of the country they'd say, "Oh, we know about your band." And I was just thinking, as y'all were talking about the current members of the bands and the string quartets and all this, is what would it be like right now if the Cardozo Marching Band was going to be in the Rose Bowl parade, which they didn't have this year, and because of the pandemic, because kids came to Cardozo to be in the band, and then to be students or athletes, and then to be friends. It was in that order, really, because we know that I know that I went to school to play baseball and football and basketball. I didn't go to school to be a student. I wanted to be an athlete and a student. I'm an athlete and a friend and a student. But it's so important when we're talking about go-go, backyard, that the big G is from Cardozo, all right? And you have to, it's so important. It's not a 1 month kind of thing. It's an everyday kind of thing to make sure that when the students finally go back in the building, that they have equal access to music as they do to English and math and science. And I can't play anything but a CD player.
Thank Thank you, Representative. Representative Wattenberg. You're muted.
And she can't even play a mute button. So
I do want to get in here. It's been very hard for our schools to maintain their music programs, as others have noted. And I want to give a shout out to Hardy Middle School, which pulled everybody together in one of these Zoom videos. I think there were 50 or 60 of their musicians all playing in their own square, playing We Shall Overcome for Black History Month. And if somebody would tell me how, I would actually try to put it onto the YouTube screen, but it was really great. And
the director was Joseph Chisholm, a Cardozo marching band member, and also one of my football and baseball players.
why am I not surprised?
I'm appreciating all of the acknowledgement and name dropping. I'm going to take the liberty to go myself. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Dunbar High School and the many Ward 5 programs. And I fully appreciate how music fed into my life and served as an engagement tool for me growing up. And it seems like many of us have had different experiences, either playing an instrument or some other type of musical activity that has also enriched our lives. And so with that, as we talk about well-rounded education, certainly musical programs need to be a part of that. And I look forward to working with you all to ensure that we can advance and make sure all students have access to these programs in DC. With that, Mr. Hayworth, can you call the roll?
Dr. Gasoi.
Aye.
Mr. Chang. Ms. Wattenberg.
Aye.
Dr. O'Leary. I think we may have lost Dr. O'Leary for a second. Dr. Sutter.
Aye. Also, Richard Wright, Jazz Ensemble.
Ms. Thompson.
Aye.
Dr. Reid.
Aye.
Mr. Patterson.
Aye.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Aye.
President Parker.
Aye.
Dr. O'Leary.
Aye.
The vote is unanimous.
We will now turn to our third resolution, CR 21-5, celebrating Social Workers Month. Is there a motion on this resolution?
So moved.
Oh,
Thank you, Representative Patterson. Is there a second?
second.
Thank you, Representative Thompson. I didn't see, but I got it right. With that, Mr. Hayworth, can you read the resolution into the record?
State Board of Education Ceremonial Resolution honoring National Social Work Month, CR 21-5. Whereas March is designated as National Social Work Month by the National Association of Social Workers and was first organized in March of 1963. Whereas the purpose of National Social Work Month is to celebrate, support, and uplift the great profession of social work. Whereas National Social Work Month promotes the public participation in recognizing social workers as essential advocates and resources in their communities. Whereas in March 2021, the theme for Social Work Month is Social Workers Are Essential. Whereas celebrating National Social Work Month this year particularly increases awareness of the way social workers have supported public needs during the pandemic, including, but not limited to, responding to increased mental and behavioral health crisis, especially in our schools, and rapidly pivoting to telehealth services to ensure the most vulnerable populations continue to be supported. Whereas according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there is a current estimated 700,000 social work professionals with thousands of diverse licensed clinical social work providers in the DC region. Whereas National Social Workers Month will be commemorated this year virtually on the National Association of Social Workers social media platforms, as well as during the NASW annual conference that will be hosted virtually by the Virginia chapter from March 25th to 27th. And whereas the Metro DC chapter is recognizing and sharing stories of social workers in the DC region who are continuing the professional legacies of a parent or other relative. Now therefore be it resolved that the DC State Board of Education recognizes, supports, and celebrates the thousands of social work professionals in the district, especially those supporting our families, students, and teachers during this difficult time.
Thank you. Is there discussion on the resolution? Going once. Representative Sutter.
You know, I'm always happy to say something. I'm very proud to call my college roommate, one of my very dearest friends, a hospital-based social worker in Manhattan in one of New York City's public hospitals. So when I think of social work, I think of the work that she does on behalf of patients, helping them navigate complex systems to achieve their access to services. And I know that the social workers who work with our students here in our schools do the same for them and their families, helping them cope with whatever is their need at the time, but also helping them navigate often far too complex systems rather, to access services here in the district. So very grateful for these caring health professionals who deliver that kind of compassion and service to our students and their families every day.
Vice President Gasoi.
Yes, so again, like women, our social workers are often underestimated and undervalued. And I just want to say again, I'm really proud that we are holding them up and valuing them, and that, you know, often there aren't enough social workers in our schools. And so that is another reason why I'm really glad that we're highlighting the importance of social workers. We need more of them, and we always did, but now we really do. So I'm grateful that we pass this or that we will probably pass this resolution.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Okay. I too would just underscore the importance of social workers. They, as you all know, support our students and allow them to show up as their whole selves in learning, and provide extra support to those students who need it, meeting them at their places of need. And I would say to what Vice President Gasoi was just saying, we know that this pandemic has not impacted all families and students equally. And it will be our social workers in our schools that are gonna make the difference for our students and how they come back from this experience. And so I'm honored that we're recognizing them for the tireless work that they put in daily for our students. With that, Mr. Hayworth, can you call the roll?
Dr. Gasoi.
Aye.
Mr. Chang.
Aye.
Ms. Wattenberg. Ms. Wattenberg, you're on mute. Give me a thumbs up for yay. Okay. Thank you. Dr. O'Leary.
Aye.
Dr. Sutter.
Aye.
Ms. Thompson.
Aye.
Dr. Reid.
Aye.
Mr. Patterson.
Aye.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Aye.
President Parker.
Aye.
The vote is unanimous. The motion is approved.
Thank you. And we will turn to our last ceremonial resolution of the night, CR 21-6, honoring Nannie Helen Burroughs. Is there a motion on this resolution?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Being properly moved and seconded. Mr. Hayworth, can you read the resolution into the record?
State Board of Education resolution recognizing Nannie Helen Burroughs, CR 21-6. Whereas Nannie Helen Burroughs was born on May 2nd, 1879, to parents John and Jenny Burroughs, both of whom were formerly enslaved in Orange, Virginia. Whereas at the age of 4, Ms. Burroughs moved to Washington, D.C. with her mother and excelled academically, eventually graduating with honors from the prestigious M Street High School, which is now known as the Paul Laurence Dunbar High School. Whereas despite her academic achievements, Ms. Burroughs was turned down from a District of Columbia Public Schools teaching position, a decision that historians believe was an act of discrimination on the basis of colorism. Whereas Ms. Burroughs was nevertheless undeterred and decided to open her own school for low-income and working African-American women and girls. Whereas Ms. Burroughs opened the National Training School for Women and Girls in 1909, after she was able to raise funds exclusively from Black women in the community instead of relying on wealthy white donors for financial assistance. Whereas the National Training School for Women and Girls was open in Lincoln Heights in Ward 7 at 601 50th Street Northeast. Whereas the National Training School for Women and Girls was the first school in the United States to offer a broad and rigorous academic curriculum, religious instruction, vocational training, and a boarding facility to its students. Whereas after Ms. Burroughs' passing in 1961, the National Training School for Women and Girls was later renamed to the Nannie Helen Burroughs School in 1964. Whereas in addition to her commitment to improving educational opportunities for Black women and girls, Ms. Burroughs was also a committed civil rights activist, organizing against lynching, advocating for women's suffrage, and improving labor conditions for domestic workers. Whereas Ms. Burroughs was an active member of several associations and committees, such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the National Association of Colored Women, and the National Association of Wage Earners. Whereas the work of Ms. Burroughs consistently addressed the complex intersections of race, gender, and class. Now therefore be it resolved that the DC State Board of Education formally recognizes the life and legacy of Nannie Helen Burroughs, her unwavering commitment to equity and justice, and her significant contributions to improving the lives of generations of Black students.
Is there a discussion on this resolution? Representative Thompson.
So I appreciate the board considering this resolution because DC has a rich history, and we have so many people who have come before us and really exemplified the spirit of what I think Washington, DC is. And Nannie Helen Burroughs is one of those women. I think we too often get into, oh, it's, it's Women's History Month, and we don't necessarily dig and see like what's close to us. Like we don't actually see the history that's in front of us. It also seems we don't make a natural transition from Black History Month to Women's History Month. And so I think it's really important that we lift up and we call out the examples of greatness in our city, what our city kind of has been and what we want our city to continue to be. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we do have a Nannie Helen Burroughs Avenue in DC, and we used to have a Nannie Helen Burroughs Day Parade, which two very dedicated Ward 7 residents who are no longer with us, Mr. Amin Muslim and Mr. George Brown used to put on. And I know there's some discussion about bringing that back. So I thank the board for considering this resolution, both because it matters for our educational legacy in DC and because it is only appropriate.
Thank you, Representative. Is there further discussion? Seeing no other discussion, I would echo what Representative Thompson said. We all know that DC is changing, and in many respects changing rapidly. And as a result, there is an erasure of sorts happening to communities that have long been here, people from those communities that have long been here. And so I too am glad that the board is raising up the figures of our communities that have invested so much and have made DC the rich, vibrant city that it is. I cannot help but acknowledge the connection to Ward 5 and just really appreciate the history of Ms. Burroughs and honored that we're celebrating her tonight. So with that, Mr. Hayworth, can we please call the roll?
Dr. Gasoi.
Sorry, aye.
Mr. Chang. Ms. Wattenberg.
Aye.
Dr. O'Leary.
Aye.
Dr. Sutter.
Aye.
Ms. Thompson.
Aye.
Dr. Reid.
Aye.
Mr. Patterson. Mr. Patterson, aye? Okay.
Aye.
Thank you. Mr. O'Sullivan?
Aye.
President Parker?
Aye.
The vote is unanimously in approval.
Thank you, members. We are now going to move on towards the public comment portion of our meeting. For our viewing public, at every public meeting, we hear testimony from public witnesses on education-related matters. Your comments become part of our official record. And if you would like to speak at a future meeting, please contact our staff by email at sboe@dc.gov or by calling 202-741-0888. Tonight, we will have 23 public witnesses. We will be holding to a strict time limit of 3 minutes per witness. While you speak, there will be a timer on your screen if you set your view to gallery mode. Following each group of 6 witnesses, we will pause for questions from board members, and members will have 2 minutes for questions after each panel. That 2 minutes includes their question and the response from those testifying. Mr. Hayworth will call the witnesses as well as the question period. He will also mute witnesses and board members that exceed their allotted time. And so with that, Mr. Hayworth, we may begin.
Thank you. Mr. President, just to note, for those of our public comments witnesses who have now joined us, we were in the middle of sort of the discussion when I actually hit the button to enter you into the room. So I'm just going to go over really quickly again what President Parker just said. You each will have 3 minutes, and I will be monitoring the timing. If you'll switch to gallery view for your screen, you will see a timer to control your timing of your remarks. And we will proceed in the order as close as possible to the order that's on the agenda. And we can begin this evening with Ms. Fuchs.
Sorry, is it working?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Laura Fuchs. I'm a proud teacher at HD Woodson and a resident of Ward 5. I began teaching at Woodson in the fall of 2007, so I've experienced the full weight of the mayoral takeover of DCPS. The main issue with the current system is the complete lack of true checks and balances when it comes to our schools. One of the main reasons we have a public school system in America is to create strong and engaged citizens who actively participate in civil society, strengthening our American democracy. I believe that we must practice what we preach. Schools should be a place where the community can actively get involved in decision-making of what goes on in our schools. Right now, under mayoral control, the avenues of participation are closed off to all but those who have the right connections. All key stakeholders need to have consistent and authentic ways of getting involved in the decision-making process. Currently, initiatives are churned out of central office, typically changing each year, with minimum input from stakeholders who they directly affect. We've seen this to great effect with the reopening schools, quote unquote, plan. While some of the ideas might be good, it is typically unclear how the decisions were made or by whom, and left to those of us in the schools to figure out how to implement them. When asking for feedback on these policies, it is usually right before it is going to be implemented, is done in a format that shuts its doors on most people, and does not feel like an actual chance to change anything. In fact, it usually feels like a PR stunt to say that key stakeholders were involved. If we were seeing results, I might be okay with this, but the fact is DCPS, by its own beloved metrics, has not improved enough to warrant their complete control over all the decisions being made in our schools. It is not enough to elect a mayor once every 4 years. It is not enough to have the occasional town hall. It is not enough to have a teachers and parents cabinet, which I did serve on with Kaya Henderson, where a small number of people picked by DCPS give their opinions on a very wide range of topics with little to no training. And it is not enough to have community engagement people who attend local meetings and provide a mouthpiece for DCPS. As the SBOE embarks on discussing what should be done to fix our governance system, we should look to the school boundary process as a potential model of how to engage the public. A wide range of stakeholders served on the committee who had connections to other civic associations. They held a wide range of meetings and discussions throughout the city where interested members could come and receive detailed information and then provide feedback in small roundtables with members of decision-making committee present and taking active notes. Actual policy details were discussed, and we received updates and saw the changes made to the boundary policy proposal as the meetings went on. So it's not just a fake checkoff. I also just included in my testimony a Chicago model where they actually empower their version of the LSAT to hire the principals, almost like mini school boards. And that seems pretty cool. So there are a lot of options for getting people involved, and I hope that we exploit them. And I won't be able to stay for questions because I'm in another meeting.
Thank you for being here. Ms. Kane will be next. And Ms. Kane, I apologize. I missed you when I was letting people into the first round, but you will have 3 minutes and then we'll have a round of questions. Feel free to begin when you're ready.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jen Kane. I'm the parent of a pre-K 4 student at Reid Elementary, where I'm a parent representative on our school's LSAT committee. And I also serve as a Ward 2 representative on the Chancellor's Parent Advisory Committee. And I just want to emphasize the views I'm expressing here are mine and mine alone. I'm here to call upon DCPS to reopen schools for all students who want to attend in person. My son has been out of school for more than 1 year, and although our local school has reopened one classroom per grade level, we have not been able to secure a spot. The million-dollar question parents, teachers, and students are all asking is, when will schools reopen for in-person learning? The Chancellor has stated that DCPS is planning for in-person to be the primary mode of education next year, yet he has fallen short of saying that schools will be open full-time and in-person. What will it take? DCPS needs to be transparent with the community and parents and manage expectations accordingly. We have a visible dashboard and metrics for when DC will reopen, but where's the similar public-facing dashboard for schools? Who's defining the school metrics and informing the community of DCPS's progress in meeting those metrics? I haven't been able to find it, and trust me, I've looked. And for parents, for school leaders, and for teachers, it feels like it's an elusive or moving target. It's akin to driving without a destination. How will we know when we ever get there? So who is making these decisions around metrics that would enable DCPS to reopen with adjusted safety measures? Where's the transparency in all of this? And how are these decisions being communicated to parents in the broader community? Is it even clear what guidance is being provided to schools regarding reopening and what benchmarks need to be met? Is it transparent and easy for parents, teachers, and the community to view these metrics and progress towards meeting them so that we know when we can expect schools to reopen? We need clear coordination between DC Health and DC Schools, the community, and the teachers union, an agreement in setting and communicating guidance for safely returning all students to the classroom. The other piece is that I would like to advocate for DCPS to undertake evidence-based decision-making when determining their reopening metrics underpinned by the latest science and best practices. So what does science and current research say it will take to open schools safely? Masks, ventilation, testing, and vaccinating teachers and staff. I believe DCPS needs to do 3 things in order to safely and effectively open in term 4 and beyond. Number 1, prioritize all teachers and staff for the vaccine, especially teachers going back in term 4. They should be prioritized for the vaccine immediately. Number 2, revise current guidance around the required 6 feet of distance. Research shows there's no difference between 3 and 6 feet, and this will enable more students to return to in-person learning. A 3 feet minimum requirement can be balanced with non-restrictive safety protocols, such as more frequent asymptomatic testing, not less, and teacher vaccines. And number 3, remove the cohort cap of 11 students per class and the cap of how many teachers are allowed to interact with cohorts. Without amending this restriction, there is no way our schools will return to normal. There's no such thing as zero risk, but we cannot let perfection get in the way of progress. Our children have suffered from missing an entire year, so please, I ask you to take action now to implement evidence-based metrics and transparency and how and when our schools will reopen for all students. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, and great timing. Ms. Toor.
Hi, everyone. My name is Fatima Toor, and I am a teacher at Powell Elementary School. It is a dual language bilingual school. And and as an ELL teacher, I have had to spare my breaks, times off to work on one-on-one or in small groups with my Spanish-speaking students to catch them up so that they are reading, writing, and understanding content that is on grade level. My bilingual students have been supportive and assist in translating virtually and respect the time I give to my ELL students as I differentiate using visuals and simpler texts on the same topic. In order to improve ELL curriculum in DCPS, we need more interventionists that can work in small groups with Spanish-speaking students so they don't feel completely lost. We also need more professional development trainings that are ongoing for teachers and not just happening a few times in the school year. We should be held accountable for the instruction program we are creating for ELL students to build their vocabulary and comprehension, perhaps by using the word of the day or a common curriculum for ELL students along with the scope and sequence across grade levels. We should know what is expected of ELL teachers and the goals they must achieve by the end of each grade. This spring and summer, we need to provide more small group time with a focus on social emotional learning. I have seen the burden students feel when their peers can do something they cannot do. Therefore, we should show students the power of having a growth mindset. It should be a time for them to feel comfortable and engaged through shared activities, icebreakers with an SEL focus, and a time for cooperative play to just enjoy learning a new language. We should provide opportunities for ELL students to speak in a small group setting, since some feel nervous speaking in a whole group setting, by building their vocabulary. They can also feel inspired by bilingual students in upper grades who can also help them and converse with them. Students should be able to read text at their level and answer explicit questions so that they are ready for the demands of for the following grade. A challenge ELL families face is feeling like they cannot help their child, or that their child does not want to learn English because it's difficult. Providing SEL lessons such as learning about having a growth mindset and assuring that they are in fact supporting their child by simply rooting and cheering them on. Building a strong connection with families will help them support their child. This district needs to work on making ELL students a priority in schools by utilizing an SEL component, building student vocabulary, and providing more time for small groups where they can practice speaking the language. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Medley.
Good afternoon. My name is Gricell Medley, and I am completing another year as a kindergarten teacher at Bancroft Elementary School, another language, a dual language school within DCPS. I teach 90% of my lessons in Spanish and the remaining 10% in English. With an increase in virtual learning outside of my classrooms and the restraints to hands-on use of manipulative singing to sharing, my role has shifted this year. Quite frankly, my journey in kindergarten focuses mostly on making sure all my students are engaged and are not challenged by the reception of the virtual lessons. The limited ability to work independently with the support of an adult at home impacts my classroom, particularly my English language learners. I witness inequities in my virtual classroom daily, as not every parent is able to provide support to their children. Some parents can work remotely during this time and provide much needed supervision for the school-age children. But distant learning requires much from our parents. Parents must make sure their children have the tools they need to ensure they stay on task and complete assignments in the absence to face-to-face contact with teachers and other school staff. But the other aspect of engagement, perhaps the most important one, is the emotional component. My ELL students in kindergarten, especially the ones disproportionately within low-income families, long for a safe and positive school climate. English language learners' curriculum improvement starts with the content alignment across all dual language schools within DCPS, as well as their journey within pre-K to 5th grade in elementary school. Schools should facilitate and continue engaging summer programs for economically disadvantaged students where ELLs are able to build academic and life skills during the summer. This summer, acceleration programs for students are definitely preferable in the classroom. Parents working or who have experienced economic hardship have lost their jobs, and also the overcrowded housing makes it hard for ELL students to concentrate when they are at home with the entire family in one space. In turn, this makes it difficult for children to focus on instructions as their environment is not conducive to learning. In addition to this, ELL students and non-ELL students are definitely bringing the gap of distance in learning increasing. Schools and the district should consider action on reinforcing the equity among English language arts teachers and the Spanish language art teachers. The process of designing a lesson and identifying the right resources impacts all teachers. However,
Ms. Medley, I do need to ask you to go ahead and wrap up if you can.
However, as our teachers that teach Spanish language definitely needs to add countless hours translating materials. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much for being here. Ms. Boyd. Ms. Boyd, I believe you're on mute.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Kelita Boyd, and I'm a proud mother of 3 sons residing in Ward 8. I also serve with Parents Amplifying Voices in Education and the Parent Leaders Education Board. I am here today to strongly just ask for more attention to the per pupil and at-risk funding to guarantee continued services for students and their families. Many of our schools in DC, we have already experienced being underfunded, understaffed, also experiencing high teacher turnover before COVID hit our city. Because of our schools are funded based on the number of students enrolled, the fact that fewer students are being enrolled this coming year will lead to a potential loss. We need at least $106 million to fully fund uniform per student funding and funding for students that are for at-risk, $78.5 million to fully fund the at-risk weight for the public school system. In order to serve these students equitably, DC needs to invest in and strengthen systems that support kids and families, including increasing per pupil and at-risk funding formulas, which determine what resources the schools are able to provide to their student LEAs. According to the Learning Policy Institute, an increase in per student funding by 10% in K-12 education improves the probability of high school graduation by roughly 10% for low-income students. As parents who believe that we are all here to work together for schools to be equipped and to apply best practices to move forward, especially during these times now, we think to build on truth, transparency, and trust to support all students who need us the most. How can we partner together to ensure that this happens? I'm fully here to listen and learn today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Braxton.
Good afternoon, members of the State Board of Education. My name is Nykia Braxton. I am Parent Ambassador of Capitol Hill for Advocates for Justice in Education, representing Ward 6, as well as Parents Amplifying Voices in Education. I'm a business owner and a mother of 2, a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. And I appreciate that DC allocated $6.9 million for distant learning support in the 2021 budget. I'm here today because we are transitioning into this new era of education, and we must focus our attention on the most urgent need for mental health support, childcare funding, and increased pay and benefits for our severely underpaid teachers and childcare providers. Our children, our parents, and our communities are suffering. I know the challenges and share horror of the negative effects of underpaid childcare providers, the lack of mental health support at our schools, and the non-existent requirements for teachers and staff to undergo mental health evaluations here in Washington, D.C. Imagine you're picking your 3-year up from an establishment you pay trust only to find that he's in urinated clothing multiple occasions. The staff has no clue where he's been all day. There are unexplainable bruises, and he tells you that his teachers are mean to him and your severely asthmatic daughter is aggressively pushed in the chest. It seems unreal when you first hear these things, but the most daunting part of this living nightmare is to know how bureaucratic this once creative, nurturing environment has become. I sought justice and woke up to understand the truth. This was deep-rooted within a bigger systematic problem, creating low-grade trauma that kills the joy in our classrooms. Teachers and childcare providers are overworked and underappreciated, creating teacher exhaustion that jeopardizes child safety. Meanwhile, parents are financially drowning with the cost of childcare. The average cost of $2,020 a month per child in DC is one of the highest in the country. This represents more than 28% of the median income for local families with children. This is creating more cases of financial hardship within our DC homes. DC was already facing an incredible shortage of early childhood educators prior to COVID-19, partly due to the low wages and limited benefits in the profession. These essential workers are primarily women of color who need good paying, stable careers. This must stop. We must stop exploiting the labor of women of color. We say we're all in this together, yet our tax policies reflect otherwise. A teacher earning $60,000 pays the same income tax rate that a CEO earning $350,000 pays. But even worse, a teacher's tax rate is only half of a percentage point less than that of what a multinational developer pays who's earning over $1 million. We need $60 million for childcare subsidies to cover increased costs and equal pay for early childhood educators. They deserve a decent living wage and good benefits. I'm also here because our children Most pressing needs right now, and especially given the traumatic pandemic, include fully funding mental health supports in their schools. We need $6.4 million to fully fund the behavioral health expansion, to put additional clinicians in about 80 more schools here in DC. I mean, we're constantly putting on camera tickets to protect our community. 2019 AAA said DC generated 1.3 million in camera tickets alone. And here we are in 2021, and the roads don't look any better to me. Where has this money been appropriated to? Join me in urging the city to establish more equitable opportunities for our families across the district. Thank you for allowing me to testify. I hope we all can work together more efficiently and equitably to put our children first.
Thank you very much. Members, that is the end of the first panel. If you have questions, please do use the raise your hand feature. We will be having 2-minute rounds. Dr. Reid.
Good evening. My first question is for Ms. Kelita Boyd. As a Ward 8 parent, thank you for participating this evening. If you don't mind sharing, are your students back in in-person learning?
No, my son is in virtual learning. My son has special needs himself. And definitely during this time, as a parent, I made the decision, and he's been excelling virtually.
Okay, cool. I thank you for sharing that information about, for, I guess also, since we're asking the question, whenever it is time for, what would you need to see in order to be comfortable with sending your child back to school in person, or maybe just really like virtual and want to stay virtual forever? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I definitely would not want to see my son or any other parent to see their child be in an isolated situation. With a student with special needs, social engagement is very important. And the academic plans, the way they are virtually, is not conducive of that. So I would very much for my child to go in person because he misses his classmates. He misses being stimulated in that way. And he's a hugger. So he's one of those kids that have social emotional needs. And he likes to make sure he sees people face to face. So for my household, in person will be great, even though he has been excelling virtually. But I believe that the socialization need is definitely a component that's there.
Is your school offering in person? I got 10 seconds.
2 days a week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Thompson.
Good evening. I'm going to move quickly because 2 minutes goes fast. So first, Ms. Boyd, I share your concerns about the budget. Ms. Boyd and Ms. Braxton, I will acknowledge that we've not kept pace with adequacy, which is a lot of the problem. And we're using traditional projections in DCPS in a non-traditional year as far as the enrollment that's coupled with a decrease in buying power. So we really need to watch budget cuts. Ms. Kane, and I would appreciate if you give me yes or no responses. I've gotten a lot of questions around who is asking for in-person instruction, and I would like a better sense. Would your children be considered at risk in any of those categories? Yes or no? No. Okay. Do you have any kids that are receiving special ed services? Yes or no?
No.
No. Okay. ELL, are they English language learners? Yes or no? Yes.
They speak English. We're in a bilingual school, so he's in the English track. But
no, is English their first or second language?
No, first.
First language. Are they early childhood learners?
Yes.
What grades?
Pre-K 4.
Pre-K 4. Are you an essential worker?
No.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Because we do actually have a sense of who we're offering seats to and who we're prioritized. Or who has been prioritized. If we're not offering seats to groups that have been prioritized and are underserved, that's a problem we need to solve. The question around when we open schools is a different question, and is a valid one, but I want to make sure I understand the first question.
Sure, I totally appreciate that. I think those are very valid questions that I share too, to make sure that we are meeting those needs first.
Thank you.
Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. Ms. Braxton, I wanted to ask you some questions. Thanks for being here as a Ward 6 parent. Question for you. You mentioned being a business owner. Do you work in the childcare space?
Not directly. I do coaching. I do coach some children. I do a lot of volunteer work, but not specifically. Yeah.
Okay. I'm learning as much as I can about the early childhood space and how we can best help shore up and support that sector as we move into recovery. So can you talk about a little bit about what you think, obviously more funds and support for the mental health of staff in that sector. What else do you think the city should be doing for folks working in childcare and early childhood education?
I would definitely say maybe providing more platforms where they can come together and just speak and kind of learn about the different opportunities in the city, and also the laws of how they can better protect themselves and their children. I think a lot of individuals are unaware of the opportunities the city can provide. And that's one of the issues that we have, is that transparency and actually getting that outreach into the communities, and maybe structuring more parent cafes and things of that community, and also having some type of organization or setup that we can organize even the teachers and childcare providers to also be able to, have cafes and things of that nature virtually that we can connect together to kind of just find different ways to combat these issues that we all see that are here. I mean, this is nothing new that's underneath the sun.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I do think the connectivity between professionals in different settings matters a great deal. I'd also love to see one thing that sounds important is connectivity between school-based folks working in centers, and folks working in family childcare settings to share both best practices and resources, but also to understand the transitions that happen for children who move between those settings.
Right, agree.
Thank you so much, Ms. Braxton. I appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chang.
Thank you, Ms. Kane. Thank you for being a Ward 2 parent who's come to testify. I'd appreciate if you'd be willing to share some of the workarounds that your family has taken at this time and to make things work.
Sure. I have a 1-year-old son and a 5-year-old who's in pre-K 4. We have a nanny that comes in the mornings that helps us out just with, as we're both working from home with a toddler. As you can imagine, he's very active. And then at the beginning of this year, we were in a nanny share with another family last year, but he got enrolled in a private preschool. We financially couldn't make that work. So we ended up a 3-day a week. It's called a study hub. So he's in an education pod. My son goes Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday afternoons, where he can have a chance to have some social interaction with other kids, do his virtual afternoon schooling in a supervised environment. And it allows my husband and I, who both work full time, to actually have some dedicated time to work. So that's been our workaround.
Thank you. And I guess for some of the other parents on the call, I'd love to hear what some of your workarounds have been as well for the time being.
This is Kelita Boyd again. I'm pretty fortunate to be teleworking from home. So what I have to do in my house is not really the traditional sense of most of the parents in my ward, because a lot of the parents in my ward do not have that luxury. And it is a luxury in this time. So for myself, I do understand that also I'm not suffering from the possibility of homelessness. I'm not in a situation where I'm on TANF, SNAP, WIC, and any other of those supplemental sources that I'm feeling like I'm kind of in the brink of being on the street and having to worry about the constructs of childcare and a lot of things that the parents here in Ward 8 have to deal with. But with saying that, that kind of kept the confidence in the environment of my home to be a learning environment. And so I think that's why my child has excelled, because he has those resources in his home to make them comfortable, to make them confident, and to make them be able to engage in learning.
But you've had to provide additional resources to make that work.
Usually that's like online tutoring services, because he's not as excelling in math as he is in his English and comprehension. His reading and comprehension, he's really doing well, but his math is still a struggle.
Thank you very much. The representative's time has expired. Dr. O'Leary.
Yes, I'd like to, all of you are elementary school parents, and I just would like to know quickly, and if you can, I can't see everybody on my screen. Well, I guess I can. I just have to go to a full screen. I'd like to know what, if you had to give a grade of 1 to 5, 5 being a really good and 1 being not so good, what you would give to this virtual learning experience. And I've got 1 minute and 25 seconds. So anybody, 1 to 5.
I would say compared to last year, I would give it a 3 to 4. Last year, I would have given it a 1 to 2. I think our teachers have figured out how to make this work. Unfortunately, my son is in a situation where his teacher got pulled back in, so he has many more kids in his virtual learning class. And I've seen the teachers struggle, and she's actually stepped up and is now doing 12 virtual classes. So I know it's really hard on the teachers to keep doing and dealing with 24 young 3- and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds virtually. But
Great.
they're doing an amazing job.
Ms. Braxton?
I'm going to have to say a 1. I don't think that some of the children's age is appropriate for them sitting at the computer as long as they have. I find that especially with children that have attention deficit disorders, that is not really working that well. I know my son is not one that's able to sit still for a very long time. So I actually had to pull him out to do homeschooling with him. And so I'm hoping that we will get to a point where we can transition back into the school system, but having to do a combination of things and a combination of programs to really capture his attention, because I don't want education to be something that's like a chore. This is something that we want our children to enjoy. And I've been privy to some of my other families who I've monitored their children, and it's like they have these large gaps in the middle of the day that's not, it's not constructive. And then bringing them back to get focused, it cuts off their concentration and focus. So I personally am not pleased, but I do know that the school board has been working hard and these teachers have been working really hard. So I would say a 1, but I do applaud the efforts that are being applied.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gasoi.
Thank you. And thank you all for your testimony tonight. And I, like Representative Thompson, shared the concerns some of you expressed about the budget. And thank you, Ms. Braxton, for the points about our inequitable tax system. That was very interesting and edifying. My questions are for Ms. Medley. Thank you for being here from Bancroft. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you think we can address some of the inequities that you're seeing. What are ways that we can advocate? And then also specifically about the point you brought out about Spanish-speaking teachers being called on to translate. Is there any ideas you have for addressing that issue? So it's really 2 questions.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. I will say it's just, we start with awareness. It seems like for the English language students, they always have to do double duty. They are learning, but they are learning in an environment that is not conducive to learning. Parents are trying to support, but they don't have the jobs that make them able to be there for their kids. The teachers are trying to provide the best resources to the students, but in order to do that, they have to do the double duty of translating or finding the right. We all teachers are working extremely hard. The parents are working extremely hard, and the students too. But it seems like there is not a sense of proportion. Everything seems to be a double duty for the English language learners, and that is very concerning.
And what about translation? Time spent on translation. Should you get more pay? Do you need more
I
staff?
think that we are trying to unify the dual language programs within DCPS, and that has been a challenge. Perhaps if we focus resources, we focus our models into a one voice. I think that if we as teachers or our schools as a district, we come up with a plan where we focus and invest resources that will definitely impact everyone, then we are not going to be struggling in different schools.
Thank you so much. That's helpful.
Thank you. Ms. Wattenberg.
Hi, thanks. First, I want to just acknowledge Laura Fuchs, who has left, for raising the issue of governance and acknowledging that there are ways you can have better checks and balances even within a mayoral control system. She noted the principal selection process in Chicago as one example. Second, I just want to thank everybody for their advocacy around the at-risk, for the attention to SEL, and for different ways of trying to create safe returns, including more vaccines, more testing, clear metrics. What I want to ask each person, each of the parents really, is how is partial return working for you and for other parents in the school? So if you're in school, if you're accepted in-person learning and we're invited to it, how is that working? If not, do you want to be there, or do you feel comfortable going back? What would make you feel comfortable going back for people who are there? How's it working?
I'm happy to speak. We're not back. I would go back. I think things that would make me want to go back would be seeing clear plans around asymptomatic testing. I think that was a big concern of mine, that they've dropped the asymptomatic testing rates down. Ensuring that teachers and staff are vaccinated, that is a huge one. If they're willing to put their lives on the risk and we're vaccinating other frontline workers, teachers to me are the most essential in this community. And that the ventilation systems in all schools are up to par, that students are breathing clean air, that schools that are older have those proper ventilation systems, and that kids are wearing masks, and that's basically it. That's what would get me back in the classroom.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the representative's time has expired. Members, I don't see any other hands, so I'll go to President Parker for any final questions before we release this panel.
No questions at this time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to our public comment witnesses for this round. We very much appreciate it. If you wouldn't mind logging off of this call now, and feel free to watch the rest of it using the YouTube streaming. Members, I'll bring in the next panel. Okay. Thank you all again. For members of the public who have just joined us, thank you so much for being here. We sincerely appreciate your providing testimony for us at the State Board. We will have 3 minutes to provide your testimony, and I will be calling you as close as I can to the order that is on the agenda on our website. But give me a few seconds here, because I do actually want to make one quick change, and to note for members that we did have a number of folks who were unable to join us at the last minute today. So some of the witnesses that are listed on the agenda will not be testifying today. But we do have some students that will, one student who will be providing testimony. So I'd like to move to the student next. Her name is Emilie Kpadea, and she will be providing testimony on behalf of a number of other students who I believe are watching on the YouTube stream. So I'd like to go ahead and mention their names specifically so that you know who they are. Nisa Adams, Diaru Bayo, Damia Brown, Lydia Fikra, and Elena Ransom. So I'm going to turn it over to Emilie to provide the testimony for those students now. Welcome, and feel free to begin when you're ready.
Good evening. My name is Emilie Kpadea, and I'm a tutor with Reach Incorporated. Tonight, I'm representing the testimony of the people that were listed. At Reach, we're trained as literacy tutors, and we work with second and third grade students. We're here today to speak to you about the changes to the community service requirement that will make it equitable. Currently, the policy states that all community service hours must be non-paying voluntary service. The problem is that Reach tutors get paid. The current policy also states that community service is an independent act of providing a needed service to a person or persons. It helps to foster a lifelong habit of serving others, to increase a student's sense of social responsibility and civic engagement, to provide opportunities for students to identify and engage in issues impacting their community. And it also provides access to real-life authentic experiences that will provide them for post-secondary success. We believe that there are 3 issues with the current policy. First, if all the goals stated above are being met, students should be able to earn compensation for service hours. At Reach, we learn to serve others, engage in issues impacting our community, and have a real-life experience that prepares us for success. Plus, we are able to earn funds necessary to support ourselves and our families. Second, forcing participation in service is demotivating because it turns an opportunity to pursue passions into a task to be completed. We often don't have much control over our projects, and we can't guarantee the quality of the opportunities. Finally, the process is burdensome. We must identify the opportunity, receive pre-approval, do the service, write the reflection, and send the paperwork to our counselor. The good news is, however, we think that the policy can be changed to be more reasonable and more equitable. First, we should reduce the number of required hours. The current policy creates stress, especially during the pandemic. Reducing the number of required hours would allow students to focus on academics and other extracurricular opportunities. We believe that a 50-hour requirement is fair. Additionally, we believe that students should be able to earn community service hours for paid work, like the tutoring we do at Reach. We are serving our community and supporting our families. We should not be forced to choose between the two. Finally, to better support the quality projects that put together service and students' interests, schools could design specific service learning classes through which students could create and execute service projects while earning hours during instructional time. It is important that we make these changes now, as the students are already stressed due to the pandemic. Students are already stressed thin, and these changes would allow us to focus on our academics and our overall well-being. Teens are being asked to take in a lot right now, and any reduction will lead to improved quality of life. Additionally, the pandemic has hurt the economy, and many teens are trying to contribute by working to support their families. This means that the teens with the least money often have the most stress. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ms. Padilla. We really appreciate you being here. I'm going to turn now to Mr. Hecker.
Thank you. Just before me, you had the opportunity to hear from Emilie, and I'm incredibly proud of her for the testimony she just gave. And I'm here representing my opinions on behalf of the students I work with at Reach Incorporated. I think there's little doubt that our teams achieve the goals of the current community service requirement, and that they foster a lifelong habit of serving others, increase students' sense of social responsibility and civic engagement, provide opportunities for students to identify and engage in issues impacting their community, and provide access to real-life authentic experiences that will prepare them for post-secondary success. At Reach, our teams spend up to 60 hours a year tutoring elementary school students. They spend an additional 60 hours training to be high-quality literacy instructors. 2 of the 6 teens that contributed to the previous testimony, including Emilie, are also published children's book authors, and they're regularly sharing their work with public audiences. But we pay them. Kashmir, a 2020 graduate of Anacostia High, who Representative Reid recently supported in her college goals, spent more than 200 hours tutoring students at Ketchum Elementary School during her time as an Anacostia student. She became interested in a career in service, she became committed to her former elementary school, and she felt like she was impacting her community. And she had a real service experience in a work-life environment. but not one of those hours counted towards her community service graduation requirement. I should mention that Kashmir was also raising a son. Who are we to assume that she has time for unpaid labor? Over the last 10 years, many industries have acknowledged that unpaid internships perpetuate structural inequities. It's time for our school system to recognize the same. While the teens I support offered multiple solutions, I feel strongly that first and foremost, we must eliminate the requirement that service hours be unpaid. Our teens often need to bring revenue into their homes and families. Many in the nonprofit community are working to create additional paid learning and service opportunities. Maintaining a policy that requires unpaid work is harmful to students who already have the most to overcome, like Kashmir. Service cannot equal free. I hope you can recommend this change to DC's graduation requirements so that those teens deeply invested in contributing to their communities through tutoring or in some other way receive credit for their service, even if it's paid. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fitz.
Great, thank you. Good evening, my name is Patrick Fritz and I'm a current treasurer of Langley Elementary School PTO. I have 2 children at Langley, a Title I pre-K 3 to 5th grade elementary school in Ward 5 with over 330 students. I'd like to start by recognizing the incredible efforts of the Langley teachers who have done an amazing job teaching and caring for our kids during this extraordinary time. As a parent and DC resident, I'm not as happy about the current state of Langley's buildings, but the school has built a supportive environment for the children. Myself and many other PTO members have a number of concerns about these buildings. There are serious issues that pose a threat to the health and safety of our students, educators, and families. Langley's in desperate need of a full modernization. Built in the 1920s, it was constructed to be a middle school. We have only received phase 1 modernization back in 2011. Phase 2 and phase 3 have yet to be assigned a date. Our student bathrooms are in desperate need of upgrades. They have no ventilation and fall on the extremes of very hot or very cold. The sinks are too high for the kids to reach, many of the kids to reach, and most kids can't even operate the outdated faucets without the help of a grown-up. We also do not have a usable restroom on the bottom 2 floors of our building. The one in the cafeteria has a hole in the wall and only 1 toilet. We need a new roof. We have had leaks all over the building year after year. This leads to the ceiling crumbling in classrooms, hallways, and throughout the school. Repairs are simply patch jobs at this time. We need a modern HVAC system. We have radiators and window units. The system is not properly maintained and rooms are either, again, extremely hot or cold. Pipes burst and have flooded rooms, damaging schools and supplies and furniture in an already strapped Title I school. There are no working intercoms in the gyms, cafeteria, and in some offices, presenting a liability to the safety of our students and educators. Rodent infestation has not been eradicated, and the problem will not be solved until the building is modernized. These facility upgrades are necessary to ensure that our school is safe and properly functioning. Under the current conditions of facilities, I know that many parents are debating whether to send their children back to Langley. Anecdotally, I've heard of neighborhood families touring other schools and wanting to send their kids there instead of Langley due to the fact of the building conditions. There's a lot of talk these days about equity, and we need to see that in our schools. Ward 3 have all been modernized, yet Langley and Ward 5 still does not have a modernization date. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sharp.
Hi, thank you. I'm Matthew Sharp. I'm a kindergarten parent in Ward 2. I wanted to make 2 points and one request, all in the direction of seeking to reopen schools in person. The first point is that a year into the pandemic, we know more now than we did when the students were sent home. The costs of virtual learning, especially for the youngest students, has turned out to be higher than we might have been able to guess a year ago. Measured learning loss now is deeply troubling, and the broader health effects on children who have been kept from their schools are becoming painfully clear. It's undeniably hurting our children to keep them at home. At the same time, we know now that the risks of returning students to school are less than some feared a year ago. We didn't know then, but do know now how COVID spreads in schools where safety precautions are being taken. We didn't know then, but we do know now the role of surfaces in the spread of COVID and the effectiveness of measures like masks. We didn't know then, but we do know now the degree to which children are susceptible to the worst health impacts of COVID. With the improved knowledge that we have now, it's become clear children are safer in schools than we could have known when this all began a year ago. My second point is that the school system should not be treated inconsistently with our city's broader approach to the pandemic. Restaurants, gyms, offices are all opening. Workers, including parents, are returning to work. These places entail a higher risk of boosting community spread of COVID than schools do. We now have effective vaccines, distribution of which is moving quickly, including for teachers and school staff. Schools should be among the first places to open and not the last. And last, my request, there are concrete policies that need to be revisited in light of the information that we have now and the realities of our city's current situation with respect to the pandemic. The limit on the number of students per classroom should be revisited. The 6-foot distancing requirement should be relaxed. Maintaining those requirements prevents students who want to be in school from returning, and they are inconsistent with both what we now know about the risks of COVID spread in schools and our approach to other elements of our local society. They should be adjusted to reflect those current facts. Keeping our schools closed is undeniably exerting a significant and cumulative cost on our children's health and education. A decision to maintain the status quo demands a defensible justification. I hope this board will be part of a solution to what has become a serious problem for our children. And lastly, with a few seconds remaining, I did have the chance to read through the other written testimony and the speakers on the previous panel, as I'm sure you all have or will have the opportunity to read. I'm just struck by how repetitive what I'm saying is with what you're hearing from other parents, and also with the level of desperation and urgency that comes through in a lot of those messages. I think from the perspective of parents, we see the rest of the city starting to turn its attention to a post-pandemic world, and we're very worried about getting left behind. And so I would beg this board to not move on, but to focus on the issue that seems most central to those of us who are parenting students in the schools. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Sharp. Ms. Sims.
Good evening, members of the board. My name is Leigh Sims, and I'm a proud parent of a budding preschool student. My family and I live in Ward 6. I also serve with Parents Amplifying Voices in Education, PAVE, as a Ward 6 PLE board member. In the fiscal year 2021 budget, we saw many important investments in parent priorities, including a 3% increase in Uniform per Student Funding Formula, UPS-FF, and an additional $300,000 in funding for at-risk students. Those were important investments. Today I'm testifying before you because we need to see a UPS-FF and at-risk weight that is funded to the recommended adequacy levels. This ask is important for my family because we chose this city as our home, and we hope that while we choose to remain Washingtonians, we get to see all of our community members access the best this country has to offer. The students were always a year ahead, as a child, I used to beg my mother and father to send me to private school. The students were always a year ahead in math, and their required reading seemed to be just a little bit more interesting to me. My private school request was never realized, even though I tantrumed about it all through middle school and even in the beginning of high school. One day, my mother sat me down and explained to me that she and my father were strong public school advocates. And as long as they were able, they would select their place of residence based on the quality of the public school education provided in that district. Tonight, I share with you an aspect of our school system that needs your support. DC should invest in equitable school funding and funding for students who are most vulnerable, including $106 million to fully fund the UPS-FF per pupil funding and $78.5 million to fully fund the at-risk weight. The 2013 adequacy study reported that the base UPS-FF should be $11,638 when adjusted for inflation. However, the UPS-FF is currently set at $11,310, a gap of nearly $328 per student. The 2013 study said that the at-risk weight should be 0.37 or $4,062 per student. The at-risk weight is currently set at 0.22 or $2,551 per student, which is a gap of $1,879 per student. Even though I was a public and charter school teacher for more than 10 years, the statement my mother made to me so many decades ago hits home literally as I think about my son's public school trajectory. I have to ask myself, if the city is not working at the margins, are they not performing a disservice to all? In other words, if it's not good enough for my neighbor, it's not good enough for me. Thank you for allowing me to testify and share what I see for our kids and our city. I hope you will consider supporting the full funding of the UPS-FF at-risk weight for the betterment of our community and the benefit it will provide to our kids. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sims. Ms. Zapata.
Hello, this is State Board of Education representatives. My name is Miguelina Zapata, and I am a Ward 4 resident and proud parent of 3 children. Two of them who attend Breakthrough Montessori Public Charter School, and my other child is in daycare. I serve on the Parents Amplifying Voices in Education PAVE Ward 4 PLE board. I'm talking to you today to express the importance of school-based mental health supports. I'm a speech and language pathologist, and I see how bright and intelligent my students are. However, students can learn if they're not mentally stable and are not able to have their trauma or mental health needs addressed. Additionally, students are not socializing or getting supports they need, which in turn make them fall behind emotionally and academically. Increasing mental health supports in school have been a PAVE parent priority even before this pandemic. We're asking you to please help support efforts to fund the $6.4 million needed to fully fund the behavioral health expansion and put clinicians in at least 80 more schools, and a total of $10.8 million of social emotional learning and trauma-informed training in all schools. With this COVID crisis, mental health support have been at the forefront of this pandemic. Parents and other caregivers must juggle being parents, teachers, and do their full-time work at home. With this crisis ever changing and knowing that even if they go back to normal sometime soon, students will exhibit more difficulty to tap into their full potential due to the increased mental health issues. This increase in school-based mental health supports will make a difference for these children and adults who are experiencing incredibly stressful situations, which in turn decrease their emotional and academic performance. We need to make sure families are mentally stable and so that students can go back to school and be readily available to learn. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for being here. Ms. Rutherford. I believe you're still muted. Oh, you can't unmute. Okay. Let me see if I can send you a message to unmute. Hold on 1 second. I believe she's trying to log in from her phone. 1 second.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'll just keep that muted. Okay, good evening, State Board of Education representatives. My name is Nia Rutherford. I live in Ward 7, and I'm speaking out here today with Parents Amplifying Voices in Education. My daughter Nova attends Rocketship Legacy Prep in Ward 8, and I am an early childhood educator. As an educator, I know that all kids deserve quality education, but as a mother, I am even more committed to making sure that this is possible, not only for my own daughter, but for kids across the district. The pandemic has been really hard on students, parents, and educators alike. And one term that has been used a lot is learning loss. We think of learning loss. When we think of learning loss, most of us are usually thinking about students losing progress in academic subjects like math, social studies, and language arts. But what about the social and emotional skills kids are losing out on practicing because of almost a year of virtual learning? The virtual platform isn't conducive to my daughter's learning. It's almost like the kids are just pictures in a Zoom box. And while she is virtual, it feels like there is little to no individual engagement. Each child needs to be acknowledged for who they are and their distant learning style. Before the pandemic, when in-class learning was happening, my daughter Nova had an individual job of saying the motto each day in class. Boy, was she so proud of this job and would be so happy to talk about this role. But how do we replicate those types of feelings and activities in a virtual setting? Even in my own classroom, there have been times when we've tried to schedule meetups with the kids where the whole class would get together, but it's like the first day of school every single time. For kids who are at such an important age in early childhood education, It's sad that they barely know how to interact with their friends and classmates or how to express their needs to teachers and adults like kids their age should. Teaching and practicing peer interactions like conflict resolution has been challenging on the virtual platform. So as we consider a future that will most likely include a mix between virtual and in-person learning, we have to keep this in mind. This is just one example of why the city's investments in SEL is so important and why you should support PAVE parents when we ask for $10.8 million investment in social emotional learning and trauma-informed training in schools. I believe that we also need to think creatively about how to support outdoor learning options while considering some of the specific challenges that families east of the river face, especially in terms of safety concerns. Thank you for the opportunity to share my testimony today, and I hope that the State Board of Education will support our request to systems leaders in the district for greater investment in SEL and trauma-informed training, especially for our early learners. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your testimony and for all of the testimonies that we've received tonight. Members, we will now start our question round. As with the previous round, each of you will have 2 minutes to testify. Members, please do use the raise your hand feature, and we'll go as closely as I can to the order in which you raised your hand. Dr. O'Leary.
Yes, I want to thank all of the panelists for your testimony, and you're giving the big ask is that the state board is able to get the funding and the state board is able to change the community service hours and blah, blah, blah. And we would love to do that, but we're not able to do that right now. But what you have been saying is so important because you've given a personality to the ask itself. I'm a community service guy. I think community service is very important. I think that I don't think 100 hours of community service in 4 years is enough, to be honest with you, if it's done correctly. I know about the funding and I know about how virtual learning isn't the answer, but I really appreciate your testimony. And I hope that the people who are responsible for that money and responsible for those changes are listening to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. O'Leary. Dr. Sutter.
Thank you so much. Ms. Sims, thanks for coming and representing Ward 6 parents. I'm going to give my time, though, to Emilie because I'd love to talk more about your testimony on community service. Emilie, you did a wonderful job sharing on behalf of you and your colleagues at REACH. I got one of my REACH student texts with me just for fun. But I'm curious to know more about how you think the board, if we change the requirement to 50 hours and we thought about how to allow for paid service, can you talk about how you would distinguish what made paid service versus a regular paying job? Because I listened to you talk about REACH and they're pretty different. The way you talk about your tutoring service and what I might think about like my job in the mall as a high school student. So can you talk about how you think of them as different? I think you might be on mute. It's not working, she says, John Paul.
Okay, if we can pause the timer and give Ms. Kpadea a chance to hopefully fix this issue. Dr. Sutter, did you have another question you want to move to and we'll move back?
Sure, I'll ask Mr. Hecker if he'll weigh in on that first while we wait for Emilie.
I was going to say I was in the meetings as they discussed these issues and wrote their testimony, so I'm happy to jump in. That was actually a question that they came up with and something that was very difficult. The example they used was if someone's working in a grocery store and they're arguing that they're providing a service to the community by making sure people are fed, how is that different? I think where we settled was if we fulfilled all of the other requirements of the community service policy as it stands, which is about it. I mean, an obvious community need, building up a lifetime of learning We sort of focused on the other aspects, the 4 bullets in the policy, and if we met those, we felt it fair that that it count. And I think right now the only difference that's preventing this from counting as service is the payment.
Yep. I appreciate that. And I appreciate that sort of process of reflection. Service learning, which you both mentioned, I think is really key here. The notion that we don't want community service to be done in a vacuum, but we want there to be a connection for students between how they are serving and what they are learning and the opportunity to reflect and provide that in a meaningful way. And in full disclosure, my first 2 years of teaching out of college were as a full-time volunteer who nonetheless was compensated. I had a roof over my head, a car in my name, and a community service award that paid off my student loans. So it was service, but I was compensated. And I don't think I saw any tension in those things. I really appreciate the testimony, Emilie. I'm sorry we couldn't hear your voice again, but hopefully we can get that fixed. Thanks very much, Mr. Hayworth.
Thank you, Dr. Sutter. Mr. Patterson.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the testimony this evening. Representative Sutter took a lot of the fire out of what I was going to ask because my questions were toward Emilie and Mr. Hecker as well. I do want a little bit more clarity. Are we talking about, when we say reduce it to 50 hours, are we talking about 50 hours over the course of high school? Because right now it is 100 hours. Are we talking about reducing it to 50 hours over the 4 years of high school?
Yes, that was their idea.
Okay. And would we, or were there discussions about doing away with the hours totally and just going to like paid fellowships, which were kind of like in the same type of tenor as Representative Sutter spoke about?
Yes, that was a big part of the conversation, that 50 hours is sort of their compromise offer. They think that it's fine to stay at 100 if they can claim hours for which they get paid. And responding to Dr. O'Leary's comment, our teens do hundreds of hours of service. So they're doing more than the 100 hours. It's
That's
just,
exactly
it doesn't
what I was
count.
trying to get to. Like, if we went to that type of system, I wouldn't want to limit their ability to make money, you know, as long as it didn't interfere with their academic work.
We're happy to keep paying them.
Exactly. That's what I was trying to get to. And I don't know how many seconds I have left.
45.
I did want to give a shout out to Ms. Rutherford because as a former Rocketeer, I truly understand and know Legacy quite well, and I look forward to working with you. I'll just leave it at that with my last 30 seconds or so to work with you and Principal Stewart on some of the things that you brought up, okay? So would love to follow up with you, okay?
Thank you very much, Mr. Patterson. Dr. Reid.
Good evening, everyone. Emilie, kudos to you on authoring a book. That's amazing. Ms. Zapata, thank you for being a speech therapist. I too am a speech pathologist, and you are totally right around social emotional. We're talking about mental health workers, but you know, speechies are kind of trained in this stuff too. But my questions are going to go for Ms. Rutherford. Thank you for choosing our great schools to send your student to. Question for you about, you know, you being ready to send your child back. If school were open, what are your thoughts? Like if school were open tomorrow, would you send your child? Do you think we just need more time and look at the fall? What items need to be placed? I'm interested in hearing all that from parents who are choosing Ward 8 schools.
I had to find my mute button. Sorry. Is it an echo?
It's good now.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. So in regards to your question, oh, hello, sorry, Miss Colleen. In regards to your question, in regards to my daughter returning to school, so I have kind of like, honestly, I have like mixed reviews about that. As a teacher, I'm nervous to go back, but as a parent, I'm like excited for her to go back. I do want her to get that opportunity to be able to engage with her peers. Like I said in the testimony, I have had meetups with students and it's hard for them to interact with one another. They stay near the parent, they cling to the teacher. And I'm like, you have all of these friends here, you know, and it's an awkward situation. So in regards to, you know, my daughter going back, I'm not gladly sending her back, but I understand the importance of sending her back. And I'm not against any of the social distancing things. My daughter can keep on her mask all day. She knows that if she needs to take it down, she can step away. breathe a little bit, come back. So I'm not afraid in that aspect. It's more so everybody else's kid. But I think that going back would be a wonderful opportunity, especially for her, because she doesn't have any other siblings at home. Much like a lot of the kids that I work with, they don't have siblings at home. So that interaction with their peers is a hard thing to do. And they're around adults all the time. So they're interacting like adults, and they're missing out on that opportunity to be kids and have that kid space with one another. So I would send her back. Yes, I would. Me, on the other hand, I'm not. I'm not sure.
Thank you for expressing that. Thanks.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reid. Ms. Thompson.
Good evening. I have a mixture of questions and comments, so I'm going to again try to move pretty quickly. Mr. Fritz, I think is your last name. I'm going to start with you from Ward 5. So I want to acknowledge your testimony. I have a lot of schools that are in the same boat in Ward 7. Those schools are disproportionately, just like yours, serving Title I students, and they're disproportionately located in 5, 7, and 8. So I'm here with you, and we as a city have been fighting that fight around modernization, and I'll continue to fight that fight because it's the right fight. So I appreciate that. Ms. Kpadea, I appreciate, I know you were having some mute issues. I don't have a question. I understand what you're saying. I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. I agree with you and commit to following up to figure out how to work with you to get what you said done. I will say that as someone who had to make choices about what I could and could not do, despite being a very good student, and chose to pass up some opportunities because they couldn't pay me, and I'm the oldest child, and I don't come from a family that just says, go live your best life no matter the cost, because they can't pay all the costs. I respect and appreciate your testimony. Mr. Sharp, I'm going to ask you the same questions that I asked to the other person because I want to make sure I understand the request for in-person learning. So first, are your children at risk? And I would appreciate yes or no because I have seconds.
No.
Okay, thank you. Do you have students in need of SPED services?
No.
Are they English language learners?
No.
Are they early childhood?
Yes.
Are you an essential worker?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that because we do have a prioritization. And I think the first problem that we need to solve is making sure those who should be offered seats are offered seats, or we have said should be offered seats, and then we need to start working on full in-person. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Hayward, and thank you all for being here with us to testify. I want to give a special shout out to Emilie for your testimony because it was very powerful, and hearing from students is always great, especially in environments where we're talking about education and we're talking about students' own experiences. And I hope your unmute button is working now, because I wanted to ask you a question, because I 100% agree with you about volunteer service hours, and I kind of think it's an antiquated system. But what would you say to the skeptic who would push back against your argument and say these volunteer hours are more important than paid internships because they build character? What would you say to someone who says something like that to try to justify keeping the service hours at the same level that they are right now, and also sort of arguing against students getting those paid internships?
I can jump in here a little bit to shine some light on our conversation. Emilie, you can give me thumbs up and thumbs down, or just tell me to stop talking if I'm totally wrong. And you can type, but the conversation that came up for us is most people that would make that argument aren't struggling financially the way that many of our students are. The reality is that that's not the choice point that most of the people Reach serves are dealing with. The choice point is, can I get a good opportunity and support my family, buy my school uniforms, have a working phone, or do I just get the job so I can do those things? That's the choice point that most of our kids are battling with, rather than the one about good character. So I I hope that's what Emilie would say, and it looks like she's typing now.
Yeah, and thank you for being her proxy. And thank you. I loved your testimony as well. But have a good Wednesday evening.
Thank you. Ms. Wattenberg.
Hi, thanks to everybody for the testimony. First, I want to say to Emilie and Mr. Hecker, I just want you to know that the State Board had a task force on high school graduation requirements. And in fact, it dealt with this issue and it proposed that we lower from 100 to 50 the number of hours required as a way of dealing with exactly this issue. And it was not taken up. The way our system works, and for everybody on the phone, we have a limited set of issues that we can deal with. One of them is high school graduation requirements, but we can only deal with it if the state superintendent brings it to us, and that has not happened. So we hope that that will happen. And because I think we all have a lot of concern and sympathy for exactly what was raised there. I want to also ask Mr. Sharp, just to trying to get a sense of how the schools are already open, to what extent they are, what portion of students are back, and what's the form in which students come back. I mean, is it hybrid? Is it simulcast? Who's back, and so on? And what grade level?
Thank you for those questions. I think to start with the last, the grade level is kindergarten, and we're in a very small school that's space limited. And so I won't speak to the other grades because it became something of a hodgepodge approach, grade by grade, to parcel out the space that was there. But for the kindergarten classes, which total about 30 students, I think the breakdown is a third that are in person full time, a third that have 2 days a week of CARES class, and our daughter is in that category. And then about a third that are staying home and fully virtual.
Thank you. I'd ask you more, but my time is up.
Thank you, Ms. Wattenberg. Mr. Chang.
Thank you, Mr. Sharp. Thanks for representing Ward 2. I'd appreciate it if you'd be willing to share if you've needed to do anything extra, either time-wise or put resources somewhere to make the education for your kids work this year.
Yeah, no, it's the right question for sure. I think in the fall, we had 2 parents that were working full time and no ability to go into the school. And so the extra measure that we took was to essentially stop sleeping. And that worked out badly, it turned out. And I think we felt that was quickly, it became clear that was not sustainable. I think as the CARES classroom opened up in terms 3, we've gradually and now in term 3 fully cobbled together a bit of a hodgepodge approach that covers us for the work days all week long. And that is, in our case, 2 days of CARES class, which is 8 to 3 in the afternoon. Babysitters that we've hired to pick up our daughter from that CARES room and play with her on the playground or help her with homework until we're done with work. A day of a pod learning situation, much like one of the previous parents discussed, and then 2 days in which we've hired an instructor, a former teacher, who can come and work with our child one-on-one. I'd say that, as Ms. Thompson suggested in her questions, we are below the fold of where the need matches the resources in terms of full-time in-school learning. And so it's necessary for us to do whatever it takes to get through the week. And those are the steps that we've taken on. They cost a fortune, and we're very lucky to have that as an option, and only barely. But we worry a lot about the students that don't have the resources that are in the same situation that we are.
And actually, thank you, Mr. Sharp, Ms. Zapata, Ms. Sims. Would you be willing to type, I'd love to hear from you too, what workarounds you've had to make or any additional investments you've needed to make to make education work for your kids this year.
Definitely. In terms of me personally, I've had to put the girls in a pod and pay extra for that, on top of paying for my son to go to daycare. As you know, daycare space is very limited now with the pandemic, so the rates have gone up exponentially. So that has really put a damp on our finances, and we have had to scratch even to the bare minimum to actually make those payments.
Thank you.
Thank you
I'd be
very
happy.
much.
Oh, I was just going to say I'd be happy to submit something written if necessary. I think that was the request. Yes.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm sorry, my time is up. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to President Parker to close out for questions. Thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you all. I will be brief. Emilie, thank you for your testimony. Everything that you said resonated and aligned exactly with what I heard from Ward 5 students last year during my Ward 5 high school tour. And I appreciate Representative Wattenberg lifting up the work of our grad task force. I've asked Representative Reid to go back to the advocacy committee to see if this is an issue they're willing to take up. And she acknowledged that she will indeed do that and revisit it with the committee. I'm also going to revisit the topic with ASI in our next meeting to see what can be done to revisit our graduation requirements, because we do know that the service hours serve as a barrier for many students, and that is simply a fact. Two, to the PAVE parents, thank you all for coming out in force. I'm always super impressed. I always appreciate the specificity. It's never just give us more money. It's always down to the dollar amount, and it's always backed up with sound justification. Everything that you vouch for is in alignment with what we vouched for last month in our budget priorities to the mayor. And I'm personally a huge supporter of your work, but also the push for greater mental health supports in our students, because I know how important it is. Very quickly, I would say I visited a Ward 5 LEA today who said there's a waiting list. More parents want to come back, but there are two constraints for us. One is space. We simply don't have space, as well as we don't have enough personnel. This school in particular already has had to hire 20 extra teachers. And so I just throw that out there, that it's not as easy as, yes, come back. There are considerations that schools, LEAs are having to take into account to make these decisions, not the least of which includes our health metrics. Last but not least, and John Paul, if I can just have 20 extra seconds, I do want to come to Mr. Fitz with questions. Thank you for Representative Langley. I am deeply concerned, as many residents of Ward 5 are, about the state of the Langley building. I know this is a longstanding issue. I'm going to give you the last 10 seconds I have to just simply say and differentiate the need for modernization, which many would say wait your turn, and the issues and the state of the building now. What are those issues around hot water not working, the rodent infestation, et cetera, that need to be fixed immediately in order for parents to feel safe to sending their students back?
Yeah, I think those are the two things. I mean, it's the water, it's the hot water. There's no hot water. You know, we've got things kind of running there, and the mouse infestation. You know, it's been a while since I've been in the building, over a year now. But you know, I do recall the crumbling ceilings in the classrooms. I mean, you can walk in there and you can just you can feel it. So I mean, I think, you know, I think it really does need the bathrooms do need to be are kind of a top concern, I know, of the parents right now. So making sure that they have clean, adequate bathrooms, hot water, well ventilated, and well ventilated classrooms, clean air are the two key things, I think, to coming for parents to come back.
Thank you. And so that is my time. I do want to thank you all for coming and sharing your testimony and advocating for our students.
Thank you very much again, panelists. At this time, if you wouldn't mind logging off of this chat so that we can bring in our panel discussion, we would appreciate it. Thank you so much. Mr. Parker, I'm going to bring in the panelists.
I'm intentionally pausing this time so that we can get the panelists in before I move ahead. And it seems like everyone is here. And so members, we are going to move forward to our panel on the topic of budget priorities and at-risk funding. In more normal times, the budget process for schools begins in the fall with community engagement sessions before initial allocations are provided to schools in the winter. This year, as you all know, these allocations weren't provided to schools until mid-February, leaving scant time for the schools to revise and request changes before the mayor's budget is to be released to council this April. Some of the delays were caused by congressional inaction on the most recent COVID-19 relief bill, as the bill contains billions of additional funding for the district and schools. And so tonight, in a continuation of the board's focus around the funding for our schools amid the ongoing crisis, we will be focusing on our local school budgets. We have 4 witnesses. Well, actually, we have 3 witnesses. Unfortunately, one of our panelists notified us that she fell ill. Quorum Patterson of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute is not able to join us tonight, and we do wish her well. Our 3 panelists that we do have with us tonight include Chelsea Coffin, Director of Education Policy Initiative and the DC Policy Center, Maya Martin Cadogan, Executive Director of PAVE, and Eduardo Ferrer, Policy Director of Juvenile Justice Initiative at Georgetown University. We've asked our panelists to talk about the importance and the budget priorities they would put forth with a specific lens focused on at-risk funding. And so with that, Ms. Coffin, I'm gonna come to you first.
Hi.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Good evening, members of the State Board of Education. My name is Chelsea Coffin, and I'm the Director of the Education Policy Initiative at the DC Policy Center, where education research focuses on how schools connect to broader dynamics in the District of Columbia. The pandemic put the district's public schools through an unprecedented stress test and imposed rapid changes on how students learn. I will share now the key challenges of distance learning from our State of DC Schools report that suggests priorities for recovery. 2 of the challenges we identified were purely outside of academic needs: mental health and the digital divide. On mental health, the social isolation, stress, and economic hardship brought on by the pandemic also likely increased the chances of anxiety and depression among DC's children and youth. Even as early as April of 2020, 54% of parents who responded to a survey conducted by ConnectEd thought their children were somewhat or very anxious. On the digital divide, access to technology has improved, but a September 2020 PAVE family survey found that 9% of respondents still lacked a device and 6% lacked internet. Given these challenges and others, recovery will depend on addressing students' needs holistically. Among other supports, students are going to need more mental health resources than before, and students will continue to need access to devices, adequate internet, and tech support in the years to come as we keep what worked with learning virtually. The next challenge we identified was providing services to students who receive additional supports, especially the 16% of students with disabilities and the 13% of students who are English learners. Many services that students with disabilities require were difficult to deliver virtually, and lack of structure during the day could be difficult too. For some English learners, navigating learning platforms and school communications about resources in English presented additional barriers to learning. This means we need to pay attention to students who face the greatest challenges during the pandemic and adapt approaches to meet individual needs. Data and community feedback indicate that students designated at risk, English learners, and students with disabilities will likely have greater academic needs than during a regular school year. The last challenge I'll share was around communication. Some schools were proactive and clear with their outreach. However, messaging was sometimes confusing and conflicting, especially for parents of multiple children attending different schools, and all at a time when parents were asked to do more than ever. This means a renewed emphasis on family engagement. In some cases, trust levels are very low, and recovering will mean even more family engagement to rebuild community where it has been lost. In addition, the pandemic meant less class time and a general disruption to learning. The school year last year ended 3 weeks early, and there is limited live instruction on Wednesdays at most schools, interrupting years of improvement in learning outcomes. Early data from Empower K-12 show that DC students have likely learned less than they would have in a normal school year, and students designated at risk have likely had a greater disruption to learning than others. This is one reason why students designated at risk need additional resources as schools recover from the pandemic. The current at-risk weight is 0.226 in the funding formula, which is lower than the 0.37 that was initially recommended in the 2014 adequacy study, in part because this estimate did not include overage or SNAP students that are currently included. However, an estimated 56% of students who are designated at risk are eligible for TANF, for example, and do not receive this full recommended at-risk funding. In addition to learning outcomes, some data indicate that students designated at risk likely had a more difficult year. Of the students, an estimated 58% of students designated at risk live in wards 7 and 8, and access to broadband was lower in these wards, around 66%. And 64% of households east of the river had access to a computer, laptop, or tablet before the pandemic. In addition, at least 5,000 students designated as at risk experienced homelessness in the school year 2019 to 20, which created additional challenges and barriers for distance learning. Relevant for the overage population, high school students in our focus groups reported low levels of motivation, and an Empower K-12 Wellbeing study found that high schoolers reported the lowest levels of confidence during this time. Finally, declines in enrollment in pre-kindergarten, especially at schools serving the highest percentages of students designated at risk, will have implications for learning in the years to come. Looking at the audited enrollment, schools serving greater than the city average, 43% of students designated at risk had an average of 13 fewer students in pre-kindergarten compared to an average of 3 fewer students at other schools. 20 schools serving more than 43% of students who are at risk lost at least 20 pre-K students, around an entire classroom. Over the past year, home and learning has been more intertwined than ever for DC's public school students, often leading to a larger disparity in access to learning opportunities. In addition to correcting for this by providing resources as a city, we also need to consider renaming the at-risk funding category and think of students with other needs that should be included. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Maya Martin, Cadogan Executive Director of PAVE.
Thanks so much, and good evening to all the State Board of Education members and State Board of Education Executive Director Hayworth. As State Board Member Parker shared, my name is Maya Martin Cadogan, and I serve as the Executive Director of PAVE. Our parent leaders at PAVE did a great job tonight highlighting their budget priorities for DC schools recovery, so I'll use my time tonight to reiterate their asks, as we're at a critical juncture for education in DC and across our country. And we're in the midst of one of the greatest periods of inequity in our history, and now is the time for a bold and comprehensive plan. So to begin, I just want to start with first, lead with equity and fully fund the at-risk weight. It's really that simple. America and DC's longstanding wealth, health, and education disparities are the result of historic injustice, which have been exacerbated by COVID. Access to essential resources for learning during a pandemic, like reliable internet connection, additional academic supports, enrichment opportunities, and mental health services vary dramatically across wards, race, and class, and they've adversely impacted generations of Black and Brown families. The lack of equitable access to support has widened the already unconscionable opportunity gap. To address this inequity, we must fully fund the at-risk weight of 0.37, which would add $78.5 million, and provide the funding that nearly half of our student population in DC needs. Importantly, each child presents their own needs for learning, as there is not one universal experience for those that are at risk. Therefore, guidelines on how to use at-risk funds should not be rigid, but instead allow for targeted school-based plans. This could include, but should not be limited to, enrichment programs, family engagement supports, reading specialists, devices for students, targeted curriculum, mental health supports, more teachers to lower class sizes, and/or additional staff support. As schools determine what is most needed, they must seek out input of families who have children who are considered at risk to develop creative and community-driven solutions. What if at-risk funds included an equity council, where parents, students, teachers, and school leaders could come together to identify solutions to address educational opportunity gaps, share what's worked and what hasn't from the people most impacted, and weigh in on decisions about how to best invest in our kids? Families have unique insight that we must continue to tap into as schools allocate funding and evaluate the efficacy of these investments. Further, we need to redefine the term at risk as its deficit language. Let's respect our families and use language that centers their humanity and the need for equitable change, like an equity index. The second is really simple: fully fund our schools. The per pupil base is nearly 6% below the inflation-adjusted recommended base by DC's own adequacy study, which does not account for the steep cost of providing educational opportunities during the pandemic and its recovery. As a result, at-risk funds have been supplanted to fill gaps around essential staffing and materials. That's unconscionable. This past year, schools have gone above and beyond with a myriad of supports during the pandemic. Some have seemingly been running 2 schools at once, one remote and one in person. We cannot and should not expect schools to continue to fill gaps in the same way for another year and ask educators and parents to do more with less. Fully funding the UPSFF would increase funding by $106.7 million for all of our LEAs, which is the minimum for what schools need. While stimulus funding will be immensely helpful to address these gaps, it's not a long-term solution. Additionally, raising the UPSFF has the compounding benefit of increasing funding for at-risk students, English language learners, special education students, and more. Third, and this our parents talked about ad infinitum, ensure access to mental health supports at school. In particular, the outsized trauma in Ward 7 and 8, especially from COVID and record high gun violence, calls for place-based and extensive mental health supports for all. That's kids and communities. We strongly urge DC to add $6.4 million to fully fund the next cohort in the expansion, to add clinicians to 80 more schools. To help transition back to in-person learning and address the pain and trauma of the pandemic, the city should also invest a total of $10.8 million for high-quality social emotional learning programs, as well as trauma-informed and restorative practices training in all schools. We also asked the city to reverse the $4 million in cuts to community-based mental health providers. We're talking about helping kids, but we're also talking about helping their families and communities, and those are the backbones of DC's mental health programs. By restoring those cuts, DC will receive an additional $5 million in federal funding because the federal government matches it for every dollar of local spending for Medicaid eligible services, because that equals more than $3 in federal reimbursement rates. And last, let's invest in the continuum of care. Expand funding for OST programs, add $60 million to increase subsidies for childcare providers, which we've heard about from many families. Make sure families' basic needs are met by adding funding for internet, healthcare, housing, and food programs. In the end, let's go big for a family-centered response to COVID and DC schools recovery. Due to the unexpected surplus from FY20 and President Biden's federal stimulus funding, DC's budget landscape is looking better, but we need major long-term changes and increased revenue to ensure we can continue to fund the priorities DC's children's need. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Eduardo Ferrer, Policy Director, Juvenile Justice Initiative at Georgetown University.
Good evening, President Parker, members of the State Board of Education, and Executive Director Hayworth. My name is Eduardo Ferrer, and I'm a 20-year plus resident of the District of Columbia who now lives in Ward 5, the parent of a 5-year-old, and for identification purposes, the Policy Director at the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Initiative and a visiting professor in the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic. The views expressed are based on my research and experience, not given on behalf of Georgetown University as a whole. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I want to co-sign onto much of the testimony of my co-panelists and the parents who testified, and the recommendations with respect to the need to increase, fully fund, and rename the at-risk weight. As a result, I won't spend much of my time rehashing them in detail. Instead, I want to focus my testimony on why the at-risk rate has so much potential as a tool in the quest to help our students with the most need thrive. I'm a public defender by trade, though I do a host of research related to young people in the district. My testimony today is grounded in the perspective of someone who has spent approximately the last 15 years representing our youth and delinquency matters in the District of Columbia. Across the hundreds of cases with which I have been involved, I have never met a young person who I thought was a bad kid, or even an at-risk kid for that matter. The young people I have represented have tons of obstacles placed in their way. They have experienced incredible amounts of trauma, and they are brilliant, hysterical, artistic, loyal, kind, powerful, resilient, and full of tremendous potential. Indeed, last year, the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council published an important analysis of the root causes and symptoms of delinquency in the District of Columbia that confirms that my experience is not unique. When you read the report, the first thing that jumps out at you is a perhaps not surprising comparison of certain traits and characteristics of justice-involved and non-justice involved youth. Justice-involved youth are twice as likely, the non-justice system-involved youth, to be homeless, twice as likely to be on TANF, almost 3 times as likely to have reported neglect, over 3 times as likely to have reported abuse, and over 5 times as likely to have been retained. In other words, not surprisingly, youth who are juvenile legal system involved are very likely students who have been or should have been designated at risk and received extra investment and support in their schools. But when the researchers zoomed out a little bit, they noticed something incredibly powerful and important. They identified with data how incredibly resilient our young people are. Without getting too in the weeds, the researchers identified the characteristics of young people most at risk of delinquency system involvement based on their experiences, rather than just those who actually became system involved. These youth shared similar characteristics. Nearly 90% in that upper 25 risk quartile were on Medicaid, 25.5% used TANF, 47% experienced neglect, nearly 18% experienced abuse, over 10% experienced homelessness, and nearly 10% had been removed from their homes, among other challenges including educational disabilities, school pushout, and behavioral health needs. Yet the vast majority of the young people in this risk quartile, nearly 86%, did not become system involved. They had no contact with the juvenile legal system. Now, let me be clear. Our youth should not have to be heroes to survive childhood in the District of Columbia, but it's critical that we acknowledge just how much strength, potential, and power our young people possess that we've yet to tap into as a district. We need to build on their strength, help them fulfill their potential, and unleash their power. We do that by investing heavily directly in them, not by reacting punitively when they make mistakes. Because the reality is that all kids make mistakes, but only some kids, and in the district, it's almost exclusively Black kids, I've never represented a white kid in 15 years, end up in the delinquency system. But nearly all kids who end up in the delinquency system do so not because they failed us, but because we failed them. We, the adults, have made poor choices. We've made poor choices about what youth behaviors we criminalize and punish. We've made poor choices about our policy priorities, and we've made poor choices about how, where, and on whom we are willing to use our tax dollars. That is why this discussion about at-risk dollars is so important. This isn't just a discussion about education policy in the district. This is also a discussion about policing, divestment, and the meaning of real safety. This is a discussion about housing policy as well as economic and tax policy. And most importantly, this is a discussion about racial equity and justice. Because the fact of the matter is that the at-risk weight could be a critical tool used to invest directly and robustly in building on the natural resilience, potential, and power of our district's Black youth if it were used effectively. But as of right now, it's not being used as effectively as it could be for a host of reasons. We're not investing enough in at-risk funds. They're being used to supplant rather than supplement in many cases, and there's not sufficient transparency or accountability as to how they are being used. I'm happy to go into more detail in response to any questions. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today.
President Parker, do you want me to go ahead and start the question rounds? Okay. Thank you very much, panelists. That was incredible testimony from all three of you, and I really appreciate it. If you have not yet already submitted written copies of your testimony, if you could email that to me, that would be incredibly helpful. Members, we will be having 2 rounds of 3 minutes each. As usual, I will go in order of those who have raised their hands. And if you are not able to raise your hand, then just let me know via the chat, and I will call you as soon as I can. We'll begin tonight with Dr. O'Leary.
Yes, I would like to ask Ms. Coffin if there's any sense that there has been any kind of data in the first semester of school year 2021 as far as the things that you were talking about, especially the mental health and the digital divide, compared to 1920. And have you all gotten any kind of figures on that?
I think mental health in particular is really tough. I haven't seen a lot of district-wide surveys this year. There are, especially for kids, so I don't have any data points on that. And then for the digital divide, I think there was a survey that PAVE did with, I think, almost 1,000 parents in September, where 9% of families, Maya can speak more to this, reported lacking a device and 6% lacked broadband. And there was also some issues, I think, with the adequacy of more of cheaper internet packages for things like video streaming. But I don't know that we have a point in time estimate for those at this point.
Okay, and Ms. Cadogan, you were talking about communication. That's been one of the conversations that we've been having. We've been trying to communicate about communication since last March. And it seems as though with the testimony today that That hasn't changed at all. Can you think of any way that we can advocate that will be listened to about getting information from the system so that people know what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that we've posed, as Chelsea shared, with our families. I think one of the things that's really hard is that prior to the pandemic, many of our families didn't have internet access in their homes. And so when we went with Comcast Internet Essentials and RCN and some of the other entry-level free packages, they went from having no internet to having internet. And so our system started asking, do you have internet? And the answer became yes. The problem is we weren't asking about the quality of that internet. There's been some really great research out of Baltimore that's even in a really great article that students have been pushing because they know Comcast Internet Essentials cannot manage the bandwidth of multiple kids on devices because oftentimes they're throttling many households together. And that's more common when people live in denser environments, which is many poor people, right? And so what they do is that you think your internet is fine because you test it, but you're actually sharing internet with 3 other households that are nearby you. And if you each have 4 kids in the house who are using Zoom, that's why internet access then becomes really poor. And those are not questions that we've pushed on and really had, because instead we're trying to answer a yes, no question of do you have it or do you not about the quality of it. So that's a really good flag.
Thank you very much. I'll save my question for Mr. Ferrer in the second round.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sutter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hayworth. Mr. Ferrer, your testimony was incredibly powerful, and all the panelists' testimony built so nicely on one another. So I want to throw out one question to all 3 of you that I think connects what you said. So I think first, I heard clearly that we need to use positive language around the resilience and strength of our students. And so we need to think about changing the way we call our funding. But also we need to be thinking differently about how we interpret what the funding is needed for and used for in light of the strengths and gifts of our students. So one question I have is around needs assessment. How should we best understand and assess the needs? Is this something the system needs to do as a city? Is this something that should be devolved down to the LEA or even the school level? What are your thoughts on how we assess the needs so we can make these affirmative funding decisions?
I can feel that one first. I'll jump in. So I think it's 2 things. One, I think it's identifying the needs, right, where there are gaps. But I think it's also about identifying the strengths. So where are the places that we can build? And oftentimes when we think about the at-risk funding, right, we think about it as going towards things like mental health, trauma-informed schools, social workers, et cetera, which is important. And part of the solution for sure. We should also be thinking about how to use that on more positive experiences. Out of school time should be a separate bucket of money because I don't want, then again, more things to get cannibalized. But thinking about how we can bring more positive experience into the schools rather than just a deficits-based approach. So I think it needs to be both sides of the coin.
Chelsea or Maya, anything to add to that? If not, I've got another question.
Yeah, I think this is something that, especially during these times, all students have such individualized needs. I know there's been some talk with the UPSFF working group about thinking about a different level of funding, for example, for students designated as at risk who fall into 2 categories. Maybe they're overage and they're eligible for TANF. This year we have, I think in any year, you also have students who are parenting, students who have parents who are incarcerated, students who are undocumented, students undergoing all these other challenges that are just harder for databases to connect for different reasons. And I think this year you have people who've been more affected by COVID. They've lost loved ones, they've lost community members, they have had parents, family members who have been working in person this whole year, which is more stressful for a variety of reasons, or living in more crowded, everybody home all the time trying to learn. So I think the stress and the needs of students are going to be difficult to identify centrally, and we're going to need more customized approaches for schools and teachers who know these students best.
Thank you. My time is up.
Thank you. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth, and thank you all for coming here today. It's good to see you, Ms. Coffin, because we've exchanged emails So my question is kind of for all of you guys, but were you all able to directly speak with families and actually like have a conversation with them about like some of the things that are going on? Just kind of head nods. All right. So I guess we can go one by one, and we can start with you, Ms. Coffin. What would you say like is probably the biggest thing from like every family you spoke to about like, or maybe an underlying theme that all of them brought up that maybe you think is a very pressing issue that we should focus on?
I'll go briefly. I know Ms. Cadogan has a lot to say on this, but I think something that came up for us was mental health in general, being concerned with mental health of their students from not having chances to socialize with other kids, and also just the sense that parents themselves and caregivers were stressed and concerned about the ripple effects that has on their kids.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Cadogan.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think, that's the same, right? I think you heard it from all the parents. They were talking about making sure that we're taking care of the mental health needs of our students, but also our families, and that we're investing in students that we know need it. And that we're making sure that we are not trying to invest in every child in the city the same, right? There are some families that we know have the resources and supports to be able to support their children right now. And there are other families that we have that they're having a struggle to put food on the table. Like for PAVE ourselves, we raised $120,000 that we put directly towards mental health supports for families, groceries for families, rent assistance for families. There are folks who are having real serious core needs, and Maslow's hierarchy tells us to take care of those first. And we're just not doing a great job of investing the way that we should in the people that we know need it most.
Thank you. Mr. Ferrer.
Yeah, I'll co-sign on to that. I'll actually give the experience from a slightly different group that I work with called DC 127 that shifted its mission at the beginning of the pandemic to really actually just provide essentially or focus on providing food assistance, rental assistance, paying for therapy for parents because of how relentless this pandemic has been on them, and also getting virtual tutors and things for their kids. But the first thing they had to do was work on access issues, right? One of the forms that parents had to fill out to get technology was online, which was ridiculous. So they sat on the phone with parents and filled out the forms for them and hit send, right? It was to that level of needing to really walk alongside families. And I don't think we quite realize, unless you're in the midst of it and proximate to it, just how disconnected kind of government solutions are from what folks are feeling on the ground every day.
Okay, thank you all. And I'll look forward to following up in my second round.
Thank you very much. Dr. Reid.
Good evening. First, Mrs. Cadogan, thank you so much for PAVE getting parents really representing well tonight. It was great to see families from Ward 8, either who live in Ward 8 or who attend schools. One question for you is, you mentioned mental health supports. I'm just wondering, is PAVE thinking about the Building Blocks initiative? Attending one of the Ward 8 PLE meetings, a parent had just experienced literally hours before a shooting close by. Is PAVE planning to do just, any engagement, or have thought or have heard from the mayor's office around the Building Blocks program and how you can engage?
We haven't engaged with the mayor's office on that in particular. We have talked with folks with some of the community-based providers. So, we've partnered with WISE and other organizations. They've even done sessions for our families in particular around a number of mental health needs, but we haven't talked directly to the mayor's office about that initiative.
Okay, cool. Good to know. Okay. And then does anyone know, so I finally looked at like the at-risk and I looked at the range and I was stunned. 37 cent was the newer information. I saw 29 cent, I think, when I looked last week, up to like $5,000 for at-risk, the range. So I'm questioning, like, 37 cent, what group of children? I don't like, but 37 cents is going to who? For what cause?
Yep. So for the at-risk designation, so like this is a little bit of controversy because Chelsea was also talking about this because it's about the way we identify who receives those at-risk funds. And sometimes we've had conversations as a city that in order to increase that weight, we narrow who we're targeting it towards. And so even when we created the first at-risk designation, we understood that it was not encapsulating everybody who is actually at risk. Right now, what it covers is families who receive TANF, students who are overage in school, and students who are homeless. And so that's what the number is encapsulating. What Chelsea was talking about is we've had conversations about talking about undocumented families, which at-risk does not currently cover, and talking about certain families who have parents who are incarcerated or other kind of targeted needs and adding. But I want to be clear, when people first created the at-risk in the Wilson building, they understood that the number of people that should be served was much larger than the essentially 47% that we were looking at, right? 47, 50%. It's just we were thinking about how can we spend this specific pot of money? And that meant that we started tailoring how much we made that available and what those populations were. And the same thing happened with the weight. So the weight is 37% of the 100% of the per people, right? So 37 cents on the dollar. And that was what we recommended in the study, but we didn't make it 37, right? So now when we've done the increases over time, we're at around 29. But what we're saying is we need to get up to what the adequacy study said. But I also want to acknowledge that that's inadequate. The adequacy study was done at this point 7 years ago, right? Can anybody look back on 7 years and imagine the cost of a house in DC back then versus now? It's an entirely different city. And so like a lot of these pieces, oftentimes we're tailoring, but it doesn't mean that we're capturing everybody. And it doesn't mean that everybody who we would see in that designation, if we were really doing this the right way, would be included.
Thank you very much. Ms. Thompson.
Good evening, and thank you to all the panelists for their testimonies. I want to start with Mr. Ferrer. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I want to kind of zoom in where you said researchers zoomed out. And you talked about how many kids could be identified as like needing supports or potentially becoming at risk and potentially all these negative things, but how many were actually connected to the system. And I want to hear more from you about what targeted supports could look like and what interventions could look like for those students.
Great. And so it's this research study was incredibly well done. They basically broke it out. They looked at a big population of DC students, public school students, and identified kind of different risk quartile. 86% of those kids didn't become system involved at all, despite having huge obstacles, right? So the next thing we need to do is study why they didn't and how do we build on that, right? But if you're looking at how to intervene with that whole kind of risk quartile to shrink that 14%, it's a public health approach, right? Dr. Reid mentioned the building blocks approach. The building blocks approach is a citywide public health approach to gun violence reduction. This is the type of framework or approach that we should be using to address a host of issues. So what does it look like practically? It's 3 tiers, right? It's prevention, it's intervention, and it's reaction. Prevention looks like universal interventions in our schools that promote health, as well as preventions that target parents and families to reduce things like child maltreatment, the prevalence of trauma, et cetera, among this population, right? So it's these universal interventions. Then you get to more targeted interventions, right? When trauma does happen, or a young person is expressing symptoms of trauma, how do we intervene and get them the help that they need to heal so that it doesn't escalate to some type of harm later or doesn't rise to the level of system involvement, right? Our young people, as we've said, are incredibly resilient. If we get them the right services and supports earlier, instead of waiting to react once harm has happened, we're not only going to be more successful at helping them thrive, it's actually going to be a better allocation and use of our resources.
And my follow-up would be, other than the at-risk weight and the Building Blocks Initiative, are there other places in DC government, because they might not all appear in the education budget, where we should be focusing and could benefit children?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the hopefully powerful things about Building Blocks is because it sits in the city administrator's office. It should be able to bring a bunch of different government agencies together to work cross-agency. I think the school-based mental health program is promising, right? DBH is pushing in to the schools and supporting. DHS actually runs a number of really good youth development, youth intervention programs, tend to be for older young people, but one program, for instance, ACE or PASS, intervenes with young people who are truant. And it typically only happens after they've been referred to court. Those programs could be provided much earlier without having to get a young person's system involved or at the threat of system involvement. And it gets them the services and supports they need without stigmatizing them, without being punitive. And so it's really about taking that public health approach and seeing what different government agencies can push in earlier or contribute earlier in order to help young people thrive.
Thank you. I'm over my time.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gasoi.
I think Representative Wattenberg was before me.
Ms. Wattenberg.
Hello, hi, everybody. Before I get to my questions, I just wanted to throw in some additional data to what Chelsea Coffin had raised about the internet access. We have a report coming out. I think we're going to announce some of the results tonight, but part of it was about these devices. And this was percent of teachers who reported that this was an obstacle to their kids' learning. 76% said that their internet was too slow. So to the point you all were making, oh my goodness, how true it is. And in addition, you have people with devices that are incompatible and so on. So I agree, this idea of sort of better understanding it. You know, some of the, leaders, some of the education leaders are saying it's solved. Everybody's got their device, everybody's got their internet, and you know that that's not the case. My question, I guess it starts being to Mr. Ferrer, but others might want to also respond to it, which is in the course of that powerful testimony, and I want to also say just how powerful it was, you're talking about sort of kinds of investments that I think we're not making right now. And so my question is whether these are investments that should be school-based investments, or are these investments that should be community-based investments? And I know all of you are familiar with all the literature that everywhere else in the world, schools aren't responsible for solving poverty, society is. And so how do you think about that?
I think the answer is both, right? In an ideal world, we've got a full public health approach that includes things both inside and out of school, and there's almost no wrong door, right? So a family who's in need gets the nurse-family partnership or the early parenting or the healthy start from, right before birth, from prenatal. We're already starting to invest in them and really care for them. And that's setting them up then very well for school, hopefully, right? In school, they may be getting some universal interventions like a good behavior game, which is a curriculum-based approach to really promoting positive school behavior. That could be one element of it that's a universal intervention. If a particular young person needs support, they may get referred to the school-based mental health system, which then pushes in outside providers to help support that young person and their family. So the goal would really be kind of a no wrong door model, but I do think it goes beyond the schoolhouse. We can't just rely on our schools to handle all of the myriad of issues.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gasoi?
Hi, thank you. And thank you all for your testimony tonight. It is all of the testimony was very compelling. And I guess my question to all of you is, what do you think the main obstacles are to actualizing, the things you are all advocating for? What should we be advocating for? Do you think it's mainly a lack of understanding, a misunderstanding of what needs to be done? Is it lack of political will? Where should we focus our energy? Why don't you start, Ms. Cadogan?
Thanks. I think one of the things that's really hard is I understand that it's a pandemic and there are a number of competing interests in the city, and there are lots of things that need to be solved, right? We need to take care of our businesses. We need to make sure that, we have the economic growth. We need to make sure that our libraries, and there's so many pieces that we have when you're talking about what a city looks like, our streets and our roads and our transportation. But I think the challenge is that the way the system is set up allows people who are able to self-organize to have, and who have relationships, to have connections and to see their issues move forward. And I think we need to create greater equity in a lot of that work. Like the pandemic has been great in some ways, and that multiple people can now engage virtually and can join these conversations. And we've seen an uptick in the number of parents that can join. But there's also a challenge in that, like, now there's not a place that people can go in order to share and meet other people and have those conversations by the side, which is how you build relationship, which is something we even saw last week in meeting with the mayor's office on community affairs. That was huge for our parents to be able to just say, hey, let me get to know you, the person that runs Serve DC, and tell you about what my thoughts and ideas are informally. And those connections right now are centered in just some people, but not all of us. And so I think there are real questions that we have about the way in which we do engagement as a city, the way in which we lift up issues, not trying to make them simplified, right? I think the internet access is a perfect example of that. We're trying to solve an internet problem by asking yes or no. And yet internet is a complex problem that even Eduardo had challenges on tonight, right? And so that I think we're just making it a way too simple, because we're not doing engagement in the best ways possible in order to hear from all of our people and to make sure that people can build relationship with each other and recognize that all of this is about community. And if we're not really willing to center in hearing from every single person and lifting up all the voices, we won't get there. And so I think that's just my take, is that we simplify it and we don't do engagement in the best ways possible in order to raise up where issues exist.
I'll quickly add, the issue is not money. The city has money. They have lots of money. We have a huge surplus. We are spending the money in places that aren't necessarily the right places. We spent $40 million on MPD overtime over the summer. We spend $14 million on school security at MPD, another $20 million almost school security at DCPS. A night at the Youth Services Center, which is the youth jail, is almost $1,000 per night, right? Half of what we're spending right now almost on at-risk for a young person over the course of an entire school year. So we are spending the money. We're just not spending it in the right place. And then with at-risk specifically, I don't think we're using it as well as we could. We need more transparency. We need more accountability as to how those at-risk dollars are being spent. And we need to make sure that they're actually supplementing and not supplanting dollars that schools should be getting through their base formula.
Thank you so much. I might ask you the same question when we come back around, Ms. Coffin.
Mr. Chang.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm curious if you have recommendations of jurisdictions or other, who's doing this well in each of the domains that you're thinking of.
Yeah, well, we pulled equity index because other places have an equity index, right? A lot of other states don't call it at-risk funding; they call it an equity index. And so we're not creating that from scratch. I wish we were always that brilliant, but many times we're looking at what other people are offering. I think what's important is to understand that when you look across the country, different states are doing different things well. And so how do we learn in each of those domains, whether or not that's criminal justice, mental health, right? There are examples of how to do this work. And I think there's not one writ large. If there were, America wouldn't be America. But here we all sit. But I do think there are examples of places that do individual components of this well that we can pull from and learn how to do the work better. And so that's what I would highlight.
Ms. Coffin, Mr. Ferrer.
I think for the funding, I think DC is somewhat unique in providing this type of at-risk funding from what I understand. And I think also it's tough to compare. You need to compare DC in my mind. It's tough to compare DC to other states. You need to look to other large urban districts. And I think DC has a lot of unique challenges in the ways some barriers cut against race and class. And I think some of the best solutions for interventions and positive approaches could come from within DC, looking at individual schools and what they're doing well from a, and the needs of our students that might be tough to learn elsewhere.
I'll say in terms of a school who's doing well, or an example, I'll lift up, I used to sit on the board of the Next Step public charter school. And one of the things that they did when they were trying to cut their exclusionary discipline, so then when they were trying to cut suspensions, expulsions, was essentially launch the equivalent of a social work program within the school, paired with a shift to restorative justice. And so what that enabled them to do, which we're seeing in some ways essentially mirrored or replicated with the school-based mental health model, was identify young people who had needs in the school and connect them with services either in the school or outside of the school. And so rather than trying to kind of put out fires in the classroom every day, they were getting more at the root causes of what was driving young people's behavior and helping them heal, helping them thrive, and helping them get over that. They were able to do that in part because of the funding that they were able to get from the school. We leveraged facilities dollars while we were there, in part because we used our school almost 24/7, or we used it 8 to 10 at night. So we were able to leverage some other dollars that way. But the at-risk funds could serve that similar leverage if it's used correctly.
Thank you very much. President Parker, would you like to close out this round?
Yes, being that I'm seeking policy recommendations. On one hand, we know that all schools and LEAs are not spending at-risk funds appropriately. And this idea of supplanting versus supplementing. So the question there is, one, do you support linking increase at-risk funding to accountability of those funds? And what might be policy recommendations for how we as a city may do a better job of tracking how at-risk funds are spent by LEAs? The second question I have is, generally, we need more money and the city has the money. We also know that in some schools, there are various thresholds of the amount of at-risk students in that school. So some Ward 5 schools have upwards of 80% of its student body that would be identified as at risk. To me, funding is not the only answer. So what are some additional levers in addition to funding that we can implement that would help address and accelerate learning in those places as well? I'm gonna throw that out to you. I know that's a lot, but feel free to take either one of those. The clock is ticking. The clock
All
is.
right, I don't always want to be the first to answer, but I'm happy to jump in. But I think so. Your second question, Zach, was about in terms of funding thresholds and understanding that it's not about every school doesn't need money. Some of the solutions are larger than that. I think that's really true. I think at the end of the day, there was a good question that was asked earlier about schools in terms of being the not always being the place for solutions. Schools are certainly not the place to create all the solutions, but schools are a part of the solution, right? But we have to think about this as communities. The DC that my grandfather is literally in hospice right now and about to pass away, and the DC that he always tells me about and that I grew up in and that I was raised by was a DC where everything worked together. You had everybody knew your librarians and your teachers and your school leaders and your postal workers, and all of those services and pieces really made you feel a part of a community. And I think we've oftentimes just gotten so far away from that, and we've just separated all these things into distinct components. And so I think it's maybe not about that is the school the only answer, but the school should be part of the answer together with all of the other things. And I think that was one of the things we even raised about vaccines in Black and brown communities. Like, I've noticed a lot of people are like, oh, let's put Black and brown doctors in front of parents in order to make them feel more comfortable with vaccines. That's not who's going to make them feel more comfortable with vaccines. If your postal worker got the vaccine and your cafeteria worker got the vaccine, and the woman who runs a daycare center down the street got the vaccine, you're much more likely to get the vaccine, right? For the folks that I know. And so some of that is just that I oftentimes I think we're trying to one shot inject into one part of the body when we're not looking at the fact that all of it works together. And so some of it in terms of what I think of as solutions is how are we actually thinking about this as a whole community, and how are we giving whole community solutions? Like if your roads are bad and you're running into potholes every day and have to change your tires, it doesn't matter how great your school is, right? Because you can't get your kids there on time and you don't have the money to buy new tires every 4 days. And so we have to think about all these things as inputs, and the way we treat poor people is oftentimes that whenever we want to think about what we invest in poor communities, it's with a lot of policing. We don't just police Black bodies, we police Black dollars. Right. And some of this is just about letting Black communities decide how is it that we want to use our funds? What do we think is important to invest in? What are the things that we've seen work before? What are the solutions we want to see? And so I think that's just really important. And as we contextualize all of this, and as we think about what those investments look like, is like giving up a little bit of power and giving that power to people to decide solutions for themselves.
Thank you. You were on a roll. I didn't want to interrupt. I will come back to the rest of the panel with those same questions in the next round.
Thank you. Members, we are now in our final round of questions. If you do have questions, please do use the raise your hand feature. Dr. Reid.
Here, Maya. So I want to kind of keep this party going because it has me questioning. So is at risk the answer, this funding formula? Is it just increasing the funding? I'm just curious, or should we be thinking a different way? Oh, I saw Jock's daughter. Or should we be thinking about a different way to make sure that the equity is happening?
I do think I can start that the at-risk funding is the best vehicle we have now to get differentiated funding to schools. I don't think that there's another way to do that. And I think allowing schools to be flexible with how they use the funds gives them the advantage of tailoring, of using it how individual students need it best. And I think that's going to be particularly critical next year.
I agree that it is the best baseline that we have right now. I would continue tinkering with it, right? So the working group made some recommendations about how to potentially improve it, looking at if students fit multiple categories, is there an increased weight that they receive? They also explored the issue of, I think, concentrations of at-risk students at particular schools. We should take a harder look at looking at whether those schools get some type of additional bonus as well, because of the high concentration of at-risk school. I know the working group looked at that. I would love for us to look at that more closely, as well as looking, again, back at the definition of at-risk, renaming it for one, but then also making sure that we're capturing the right mix or the right populations that we're trying to target. But I do think having a differentiated funding stream like at-risk is a critical piece of the solution.
Yeah, I agree with both Chelsea and Eduardo. I think that one of the things that's important is that at-risk allows us, I don't think it should be titled at-risk, we're in agreement on that, but at least doing funds that are equity driven allow us to say that what every child needs is not the same. And what a six-figure, seven-figure house owning family in Ward 3 needs is not the same as what a family in Ward 8 needs. It doesn't have a car and maybe not a bank account. And no great access to internet, right? Like the needs are different based upon children. I think that is a huge investment for our city to actually put our money behind, in terms of saying that we understand that those needs are different and we're willing to invest in them differently, in order to make sure that all of our kids can thrive. Like, I don't want to hear anymore about asking Black and brown kids to be resilient. When was the last time that we asked high income kids to be resilient? We're literally always talking about high income kids just being happy. I want Black kids to be happy, right? So I think in terms of what we wind up investing in, I think it really has to look like what us saying, this is not just about you making it through. This is actually about allowing you to thrive, allowing you to have joy, allowing you to see excellence in your community every day, to feel pride. And I think that's just so important for us to invest in that way.
Thank you very much. Dr. O'Leary.
When I was teaching at the beginning of the year, I would ask my students to raise their hand if they felt like they were below average. And no student ever did. And when Mr. Ferrer was talking about at-risk funding and how negative that is. I wouldn't want to ever be considered at risk. I think we should call it equity funding. And after we call it equity funding, I think we should wonder if the city prioritizes equity funding. Because I've always felt that the people in charge should be taking care of those that didn't have rather than those that did. And I wonder if our priorities are to help those that don't have rather than those that do. And I'm going to transition in and just ask Mr. Ferrer to elucidate a little bit more about the fact that at the beginning of the pandemic, the parents were asked to go online to ask for a computer and the absurdity of that request. And that hasn't changed.
Yeah, so I work with a group called DC 127. I sit on their board, and they walk along families who could potentially end up in the child welfare system and try and help prevent that from happening. And so they provide them access to resources, parenting supports, respite, et cetera. And the biggest concern that they had was they were trying to get young people connected to schools, and family after family kept saying, we don't have a computer, we don't have internet access. And they would say, all right, we'll just go fill out this form. And then they would say, right, we can't fill out this form. And so they would literally just call the parent, and they would sit in front of a computer and they would fill out the form for them in order for them to be able to get access to what they needed. I do want to touch upon real quick your point about the equity, calling it equity funding. You know, I do think it's interesting, and I'm sure you could do the math to work it out so that it's the same. But the fact that equity funding is a derivative of the baseline, as opposed to equity funding being the baseline and everyone else gets a derivative of that, right? What if we had those in most need eat first, essentially? They get the money off the top, and then everyone else gets funded after that. I don't know how you would do that practically, but it would send a message that what we care about is equity. Because even with at-risk funds, schools in Ward 3 raise outside funds that I'm sure dwarf what schools, other parts of the city are getting through at-risk funds.
Thank you very much, Ms. Thompson.
I so very much appreciate that for so many reasons that don't need to be stated, but I so very much appreciate that. I want to pick up with first, I agree that at this point, like in reality where we are with the panelists, that we keep it, right? Like we keep the at-risk the at-risk funding and appreciate that we keep tinkering. That's where we are, and that's how you continue to provide something. I do know that I don't know if that was last legislative session or the session before, we worked actually with Councilmember Trayon White to help propose legislation that actually would weight schools who had higher percentages of kids with at-risk, because they are, like, those schools need so much more. They are dealing with so much more, and it's not true yet that we aren't laying all of society's ills at the foot of schools, at the feet of schools. So I hope that is something that will be given life, because I think it's something also that is possible that we could do now. Last thing I want to put before I ask a question, I want to put on the record that actually even now though, even when you look at schools that serve at risk, they span both sectors, and the rules aren't the same for both sectors when it comes to at-risk funds. We spend a lot of time and energy talking about DCPS and how it is supplementing funds, supplanting funds instead of supplementing them. But that's because that is actually legally a requirement for DCPS. It is not legally a requirement for charters. It's not written into the legislation. And I'm not saying the charters are doing something nefarious. There could be best practices that they have. There could be bad things that other people are doing. But the fact that we don't know And we know that they serve so many students in Ward 7, in Ward 8, in Ward 5, and we act like it's the same thing and that can just go unacknowledged, is not okay. And so when we look at it, we need to look at all of it. And we need to make sure what's good for all students is actually required for all students. So I want to make sure that's on the record because I know Mr. Parker's going to ask his question again. And so I hope when you answer him, you consider some of that. I guess I don't really have time for a question, but I'm okay with that. Maya, I understand and appreciate what you're saying because I grew up in the same DC you grew up in. So thank you for that. And I will yield the rest of my 9 seconds.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gasoi.
Thank you very much. So I'll start by just posing the same question to you, Chelsea, about what are the primary obstacles you think we should be focusing on? And then I have another question if I have time.
Yes, I think your question was kind of why hasn't this at-risk funding been fully funded in previous years? And I think a lot of it goes to the competing priorities and this tension between increasing the UPSFF by a certain amount, which may get more dollars to kids, and increasing that risk fund rate by a smaller amount that may get less dollars to schools. I think we've always been in a time, and particularly now, where we need to focus resources on students with the most needs and prioritize the at-risk funds. But I think it's a tough conversation to have. I think it's more difficult to shift out of the UPSFF, and I think it sometimes results in fewer dollars. So, the tension to consider.
Thank you. So my question, I guess it's mainly to Eduardo, but anybody can answer, maybe, I don't know, you can decide. So I assume that you agree that shifting the defunding of police in schools is a good idea. We also have community schools, and connected schools as a way to bring these needed services to students. So I guess my question is that enough, and should we just be expanding that? Should we, especially with the defunding police, which is kind of an in-progress project? You mentioned some specific things, Mr. Ferrer, but I'm just wondering if schools need more guidance, what do you think we should be doing? And should we be doing other things also besides those initiatives?
Yes, I think it's all the above. So I do believe that we should be shifting money away from traditional school security to a pot of funds that schools can use to reimagine safety for themselves. That could look like credible messengers, roving leaders, increased amount of social workers, different types of socio-emotional curriculum, trauma-informed services, restorative justice. All of those types of programming, I think, is part of that reimagining school safety piece. I'm also a big fan of the community schools. I think the research is there that supports investing more in the community school movement and this community school approach. And then I do think, back to an earlier question, is it's got to be not just the schools, but we've got to be wrapping schools around, right? It's got to be the whole community. And so we've got to be investing more in this overall shift of a public health framework. The amount that the district spends on reactive agencies, MPD, CFSA, DYRS, is exorbitant relative to the number of folks that they actually serve. And it's because we're not doing what we need to be doing on the front end. And so schools are a piece of that, and shifting those resources. The goal is almost to kind of turn the Titanic at this point, right? We've become very kind of almost back heavy, deep end heavy in terms of where our funding is. And it's shifting our focus from that reaction to more prevention and intervention. And part of that includes the schools.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth, and thank you all again for staying on so late. My question, I think, is going to be specifically directed for Ms. Coffin, but when going back to mental health for a second, do you think that as schools right now, as students go back into the school building, do you think schools are prepared to adequately address the social emotional needs of students?
I hope so. I don't know. And I don't know I know schools want to do this, and I know schools know it's a priority. I think it's really tough to know the precise ways this is going to show up next fall or whenever kids start going back in person and are kind of coming out of all of this. So I don't know. The data are really tough on that, but I know this is a big priority when we did our parent focus groups and when we did talk to some of our school leaders in our community listening sessions.
Okay, so you definitely say that, like, in terms of school priorities and DCPS and public charter priorities going back to school, that probably is right there at the top.
I don't know if I can speak for schools, but I definitely think it's something that I heard echoed in all of the focus groups we conducted and everyone we spoke with. This idea of thinking about students holistically and finding ways to have touch points with them that were outside of academics and ensure these mental health supports. It's definitely on people's minds.
Okay, thank you. And then for a question for the rest of you all, I'm just sort of thinking, like, I've been hearing what you all have been saying about how we need to address things holistically and not just address like the school specific needs, but what's going on in the community, socioeconomic needs as well. How do you think being on the state board, and although we don't have as much of a role as we'd like in these things, what do you think it is that we should be doing, maybe the people who have more power than us, to try to advocate for the well-being of the entire community that will actually affect like these students' lives going back into school? And yeah, either one of you can go ahead.
I'm sure folks can tell I'm a big fan of making a lot of noise. And so that's one way from the positions that you all sit to make a lot of noise and bring attention to the issues is incredibly helpful. And finding ways, right? On doing some kind of homicide reduction work, we asked every agency to tell us what they were doing on homicide reduction. Agencies who had never thought about what their role is in this had to now answer the question, right? So how do you use the seats that you're in to push other electeds, fellow colleagues, schools, OSCE, whoever, to really start answering harder questions around how to shift this to more of a public health framework? And you really using the at-risk dollars, I think, is an important vehicle to help make that happen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, I don't see any additional hands, so I'm going to go to President Parker to close out.
And I'm going to come back to my two questions. I'll reframe them slightly different. One is around holding the system accountable to supporting the students that we say we are investing in. We're investing a lot of money towards at risk, but still not doing enough. We know schools are not spending the money in the ways that they should. And to Representative Thompson's earlier point, we also know that there's things we don't know because there is insufficient budget transparency across LEAs. So the question is, yes, we need to ask for more money, but also how do we start getting towards holding the system accountable to doing right by kids? And the second question is around the concentration. There are schools that are 80, 90+% at risk. To me, more money just doesn't seem to be the solution. What are some additional components that need to be in the mix for those schools that need a little bit more? And Maya, you can feel free to jump back in, but Chelsea and Eduardo, I'm looking at you all to take a stab at one of those.
Go for it.
So I can speak a little bit to the concentration funding in schools as someone who was part of the working group this year. I think I agree with you that funds don't necessarily seem to be the only answer for schools, although it is more challenging to serve schools with high percentages of at-risk students. But not a lot of school districts do that, provide this concentration funding, and it's really tough from an implementation standpoint. But I know that shouldn't stand in the way of doing something, but just we don't fund anything else in our funding formula at the school level. It's all at the student level. So you need, and it's also tough for schools to rely on in the same way. If you set it at the city average, 43%, some years schools get that additional funding, some years they don't. If you have some kind of a sliding scale, it's just super complicated. So I agree with you. We need to think about some other ways to support these schools. I don't know if it's a network of, I'm sure a lot of them are already connected for best practices, but I don't necessarily think it's concentration funding.
And I'll try and tackle the first one. I think it starts with transparency, right? So a number of years ago, when we realized that DC schools were suspending and expelling an inordinate amount of young people, the change started with just requiring schools to report more and report publicly. And with light came more attention, and schools wanted to look differently. And so I would for sure start with more transparency and accountability, just around, again, unfortunately, I think what gets measured, is what gets done. And so really requiring schools to account for, this is my approach to the at-risk, here's how many at-risk dollars I got, and here's my approach to how I'm using these at-risk dollars to really serve the young people for whom it was intended.
Thank you. Mr. Hayworth, I believe that concludes our question portion for our panel. On behalf of the State Board, we want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I've been privy to some messages behind the scenes, and I feel confident in saying members really appreciated the power of the testimony that you provided tonight. It was really rich, and we really appreciate it. Thank you. And we look forward to staying in touch as we continue to elevate the needs of our students designated as at risk. Members, we are now going to move to the administrative portion of our agenda. And I'm really excited for our next item, which is our all teacher survey report. For members of the public, since 2018, the State Board has sought to better understand teacher retention and its implications for district students and schools, and what policies could be implemented to help teachers stay and improve in their practice. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the State Board did that at a time when it was often said that teacher retention was not an issue in the district. 2 reports and a survey grew out of this previous work, and tonight the State Board is excited to consider the findings of a second teacher survey. The State Board's all teacher survey asks current teachers questions about 1, what were their and student experiences during COVID-19 and in a virtual setting? 2, what were their thoughts and experiences returning to in-person learning? 3, what supports did they need for in-person and virtual teaching? And 4, what were their thoughts around retention and well-rounded education? The survey was administered at the end of January 2021 and received responses from 1,060 teachers from 185 different schools, representing every single DC public school and the majority of public charter schools. Among the most alarming findings in our all teacher survey report were teachers reported that there were increased likelihood of departures. More than 40% of teachers have considered leaving the profession because of the challenges during COVID-19. We all know how important our teachers are to student learning, and we all know how devastating teacher retention is to long-term student impact. And so this statistic alone is very alarming, but there is more. We also found that only 43% of teachers felt that their evaluation for the school year would be fair and credible. Put differently, 57% of teachers felt that their evaluation for the school year would not be fair and credible. Students in wards 7 and 8 continue to be disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, as we all know, and teachers noted lower student engagement in these wards in particular. There are ongoing concerns and barriers with technology and internet access, as we've discussed tonight. 3/4 of teachers indicated that their students have internet access that is either too slow or unreliable for virtual learning. Many teachers express a discomfort with returning to in-person learning. 3 out of the 4 teachers reported that they were either slightly or very uncomfortable returning to in-person teaching. It is also worth noting the time in which this survey was administered, January of this year. There's worsening social and emotional well-being. More than half of the teachers shared that their own social and emotional well-being and that of their students is worse than last year. These issues and experiences are not new. In fact, the State Board has heard from constituents at our public meetings about many of these alarming findings and has continued to probe and encourage education stakeholders in the district to address them. I'd also note that the survey did find some promising and bright spots as well that we want to highlight. More than 85% of teachers indicated that they are collaborating regularly with others during this virtual time. And almost 90% of teachers share that they are comfortable using the technology tools available to them for virtual learning. I encourage our viewing public to fully review the findings of our State Board All Teacher Survey, ask questions, share insights as we work to better understand how the numerous changes over the last year will have and have had an impact on district families, students, and communities. I also invite our viewing public to join the State Board for our lunchtime live event tomorrow, March 18th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern, where Ward 3 Representative Ruth Wattenberg and Ward 8 Representative Reid will host a discussion and dialogue on this survey and its findings. Our viewing public can tune in to ask live questions of the representatives via the State Board's Instagram page at DCSBOE. Again, that is at DCSBOE. So with that, members, is there a motion to adopt our report?
So moved.
I'd like,
Being that it is properly, there's a motion to adopt the report. Is there a second?
There's a second.
Being properly moved and seconded, we will now open up the floor for a discussion on the report. Mr. O'Leary.
Yes, I just would like to mention that the teacher retention survey, which we did last year, the results of that survey from teachers who had left the system, the reasons why they left the system were completely aligned with the negative reasons that the teachers talked about on this teacher survey. The impact and the climate of the schools.
Mm-hmm. That we know is very important and unfortunately has been impacted over the last year during the pandemic. And it is worth noting to the public, Representative O'Leary does chair our new educator practice committee, which is overseeing much of our teacher retention work, and will be engaging in further activities following the adoption of our report tonight. Are there other points of comment about our report? Representative Wattenberg.
So I just, in light of the fact that the whole city is deep in a conversation about what we're going to do to help students catch up and learn in an excited kind of way that they didn't get to do this year, I wanted to point out two findings in here that strike me as showing kind of the dual edge of this. One is students, we ask teachers, students who I teach are screened for dyslexia during this time of virtual distance learning. And only 30% of teachers said yes, they did, meaning a huge, huge number of students, more than usual, and we know it's always a problem, aren't getting screened. These are students who are going to be really in bad shape in terms of early reading, in terms of decoding, in terms of the kinds of skills that to me really can be responsive to something with the title high dose tutoring, right? You can sort of imagine your high dose tutor with your student who still hasn't learned to decode, and that kind of matches up well. But then, and I think it's super important, but then you ask another question. You ask, how much time have you been spending on social studies, on science and the arts? And we talked about this a little bit at the beginning with our music resolution. And more than half of teachers, I hope I'm reading this right, said that at least an additional 25 minutes was needed in social studies and in science and in art to provide the right kind of education. And what I really hope we don't end up with in terms of our acceleration is a program where we further deprive students, in using terms like high intensity tutoring, of the kinds of rich experiences that they've missed this year. So I just wanted to say that. And it's an example of some of the really rich findings in here. So many thanks to the contractor we worked with and the staff who put this together and all the board members who helped create the questions for this, and all of our allies and city brethren who helped put it together.
Hear, hear. Is there further discussion?
I will just echo what Representative Wattenberg just said, and I hope that the public will read this it's very important, and it's very rich and multi-layered and vital at this time, especially for the statistic you mentioned, President Parker, about how many teachers have considered leaving during this time. And I'm really looking forward to the state board following up and seeing where teachers are, once we're heading back into the next school year, and hopefully that there won't be that many teachers leaving, but it's something of vital importance right now. And I'm very proud that the board has done this work, but it's also, for the most part, a pretty concerning document, actually. So.
Thank you. Others? Representative O'Sullivan?
Thank you, President Parker. I was just gonna say, I love whenever we can get our constituents, our teachers, students involved. So it is, as Representative Gasoi said, it is sort of disappointing to see the results, but it also is somewhat gratifying to know at least that we know how students are feeling. We know how teachers are feeling, excuse me. Because at least now we know what we need to do, or at least we know what we're trying to do, and what we need to work from. And I'm hoping that we can use some of these results to try to propel us forward and include more teachers in the process. And I think it's definitely an encouraging sign when we are ending our meetings at 9 p.m. or 9:30, because that means we're getting a lot of teachers and we're getting a lot of people who care. And hopefully we can continue that. And then hopefully we can have more teachers be involved. And I think just from what I've seen the past couple months that we're definitely on the right track. But again, it's disappointing. It is sad to see some of what teachers said, but there are things that we specifically probably should act on based on the results and based on some of the things that they're saying. So I just want to applaud what we were able to do with this survey, and also very happy that hopefully we can continue this, and maybe we could try to do something with students as well to try to see where they're at, because I know I said it a while, but I think for me, something I'd like to see is I'd like to see direct statistics on students' mental health right now, because I think when we can see that, we can see how important of an issue it is, because I think if you were to poll all of DC high school students right now about like how difficult it is getting up in the morning, I guarantee upwards of 90% of them would say it's extremely difficult. And I think, I'm not sure who said it earlier, but someone said like high school students are having the hardest time being motivated right now. And that's something that I'd concur. I'd concur with that statement, because I mean, just from my own experience, the people who perform the best in school, the people who get the worst grades, people who are doing soccer, the people who are doing crew, I mean, all of them, they're sharing the same experiences. And that's at my school, and everyone's coming from a different set of circumstances. But the truth is, after a point, we're all going to sort of end up in the same spot mentally. And so I think it's important for us to really see what students are going through, because I think people will see how urgent of an issue it is. And I'd like to see, certainly as a priority going forward next school year, that we do whatever it takes to make sure every student has access to the mental help that they need, because we all need it in some capacity. But next year in particular, it's really important that students are able to get the help that they need.
Without a doubt. I'm not seeing other requests for comment. I would say one of the starkest statistics of the report for me was that nearly 50% of teachers said they didn't feel adequately supported during the last year, which is indicative of a systemic issue, in my opinion. Both how our city leans more heavily on accountability than support. And so at a time when schools are still talking about holding teachers accountable, in DCPS schools, for instance, administering impact, et cetera, teachers are also saying, I'm not feeling supported, I'm not being trained, I'm not getting the necessary investments, which is both unfair and I believe unethical. And then secondly, I think it also speaks to a need for grace. We know that many of us were not prepared for this pandemic. Many parents have offered grace. Many of us have had to offer grace. And again, I just go back to this in an environment where grace is necessary. We are hearing discussions of teachers being held accountable to evaluations that they don't feel are fair. Meanwhile, they're not being supported. So I always come back to where is our system and the system failing? And I think that is one of the critical areas, that we're not doing a good enough job of supporting and investing in our teachers. And a professional development session, a webinar is not enough. I'm just gonna throw that out there, that we need to do much more than that. So that is my soapbox moment. I really am impressed and proud of the work that we as a board have and continue to do around teacher retention. And I think this will continue to be a highlight for members of the council, given conversations that Vice President Gasoi and I have had with the chairman, among others. There is a high level of interest around our teacher retention issue. Mr. Hayworth, given that I believe discussion is complete, Representative O'Leary, did you have a last?
I just wanted to mention that this forum that we present to the community is really the only forum that's presented to the community about education in the city, citywide. And our ratings are really good. That's what John Paul said. We got high YouTube, whatever, those kinds.
Are we going to be renewed for another season?
I'm sure we will be, and we've got to just keep on prodding and
Yes.
prodding and
Yes.
prodding.
Yes. And so with that, Mr. Hayworth, if you can call the roll to adopt the report.
Dr. Gasoi.
Aye.
Mr. Chang.
Aye.
Ms. Wattenberg.
Aye.
Dr. O'Leary.
Aye.
Ms. Thompson.
Oh, there we go. I couldn't unmute, but I agree. Yes, let's do this.
Dr. Reid.
Aye.
Mr. Patterson.
Aye.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Aye.
President Parker.
Aye.
Mr. President, the vote is unanimous.
Congratulations, members, as well as to the Educator Practice Committee for the work on this report. I believe it's really important. We will now switch gears and move forward in our agenda to, I believe, new business. Members, are there any items of new business or announcements that you would like to make at this time? Representative Reid.
I know Representative Chang is gathering or getting together the Read Across DC, kind of coordinating that on April 14th, which will be outdoors and a variety of folks participating. So I wanted to get that out there to the public. I guess there'll be a timeline or some more information. Stay tuned, but it's happening April 14th.
Thanks for flagging that, Dr. Reid. Yeah, we'll share more information about that shortly.
Representative O'Sullivan.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the Student Advisory Committee is hosting a special meeting next Monday. So what is that, the 22nd, I
Wait a
think.
second.
Yeah, the entire meeting will be dedicated to restructuring, for the recommendation on restructuring the student representative position. Case any of you all would like to join, it will be at 5:30 p.m., I believe.
Representative O'Sullivan, did you all cover that topic at all in your last meeting? We did. And the reason we had a special meeting is because there were so many different thoughts on it that we wanted to dedicate enough time to hear everyone's concerns and also see what points were brought up the most, because I think people were kind of just hashing out their ideas. So we gave people some time to think. So hopefully next Monday, there will be more concise thought and we'll be able to hear some of the patterns on what people are suggesting, so that hopefully by the next working session, we'll have some recommendations. Awesome. Thank you. Any other announcements, orders of new business?
I'd like to just give the President Parker a pat on the back for setting up all these committees, because the committees are cooking. And we're gonna keep the pedal to the metal.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. And yes, I applaud the members of this board. There's a lot of hard work, and many are noticing it. I'll just leave it at that. I want to add one thing. The registration for the DPR summer in-person and virtual camps is now open. And so members, I would encourage you to share that information with your constituents for those families that may need that as an opportunity. And they can find that on the DPR website, dpr.dc.gov, but I can also share it with you.
I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn.
Second.
There's a motion to adjourn that has now been properly seconded, and I think thirded. All in favor of adjourning our meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, please say nay. All right, it is now 9:13 p.m. And this meeting of the State Board of Education is now adjourned. Thank you, members.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, members of the public, for viewing and staying with us.